When was the last time you pulled a cookbook off the shelf, turned past the desserts, and landed on a dinner you had completely forgotten your family used to make every single week? Not a holiday recipe, not a showpiece, just a Tuesday night meal that fed everybody and never asked for anything fancy. Those dinners filled kitchens from the 1940s through the 1980s, printed on pages that got splattered with grease and stained with tomato sauce because someone actually cooked from them. Some came from church ladies who shared their best casseroles at potlucks and then never made them again after they got too old to carry a dish. Others lived in spiral-bound community cookbooks that cost $2 at a bake sale and held better recipes than anything on a restaurant menu. One dinner on this list used nothing but canned tomatoes, elbow macaroni, and ground beef, and it fed a family of 6 for under $1. Another one calls for a cut of meat that most grocery stores stopped carrying 30 years ago. Here are 100 forgotten dinners you could only find in old cookbooks. Number 21. Fried salt pork with milk gravy. A slab of salt pork sliced into thin strips, soaked in water to pull some of the brine out, then dredged in flour and fried in its own rendered fat until the edges curled and crisped. The drippings stayed in the skillet. You whisked in flour, poured in milk, and stirred until a thick white gravy formed around the brown bits stuck to the pan. Served over biscuits or boiled potatoes, this was a meal that families in Appalachia and across the rural South ate multiple times a week. Salt pork kept for months without refrigeration and cost next to nothing at the general store. The gravy stretched a few thin slices into a full plate, and the salt from the meat seasoned the whole dish without reaching for the shaker. Most of the women making these dinners did not choose it as a hobby. The kitchen was a workstation. Dinner happened every night at the same hour because the family expected it, the budget demanded it, and there was no alternative sitting in a paper bag at a drive-thru. That daily discipline created something no delivery app has ever reproduced. A table where people sat together, ate the same food, and stayed until the plates were cleared. You can order a meal to your door in 15 minutes today, and it will arrive in a bag you throw away before you sit on the couch alone. The meals were simple. The ritual around them was not. Number 14. Swanson 3-course dinner. This was Swanson's attempt to make a frozen dinner feel like a proper sit-down meal. Instead of the standard tray with 3 compartments, the 3-course dinner came with a soup course, a main course, and a dessert. You got the works: a small foil cup of soup, the usual meat and vegetable center, and a piece of cake or cobbler in the 3rd section. Swanson introduced it in the early 1960s and advertised it as the frozen dinner for people who wanted more than a quick tray in front of the television. The packaging was fancier, the price was higher, the promise was ambitious, but the execution had problems no amount of advertising could fix. The soup came in a separate foil cup you heated alongside the main tray, which meant coordinating 2 items in the oven at 2 different heat levels. The soup was usually cream of something: cream of mushroom, cream of chicken, cream of tomato. It came out thin and salty but warm, and warmth counted for something. The dessert was a small square of apple cobbler or chocolate cake that dried out at the edges during the long oven time the main course demanded. The main course itself was identical to the regular Swanson dinner, just surrounded by more ambition. Families bought the 3-course version once or twice for the novelty, then went back to the standard tray because nobody wanted to scrub an extra soup cup for a meal that was supposed to eliminate dishes in the first place. Swanson quietly retired it. The idea was ahead of its time, or maybe exactly on time for a moment that passed quickly. Number 14. Corned beef and cabbage. You did not need the whole brisket and the all-day boil. You needed a can of corned beef and half a head of cabbage. Sliced the cabbage into thick wedges, boiled them in salted water until they went soft, and then crumbled the canned corned beef into the pot for the last 5 minutes so it heated through and broke apart into the cabbage. Drained most of the water, added a knob of butter and some black pepper, and served it in a bowl. This was the version that Irish and Eastern European families on the East Coast made when the real thing was out of reach. The canned corned beef was saltier and denser than the fresh cut, but it worked. It always worked. The cabbage softened into something sweet and almost silky, and the beef gave it enough salt and fat to feel like a proper meal. A head of cabbage cost almost nothing. A can of corned beef was a couple of dollars at most. Together, they fed 3 or 4 people with leftovers for the next day. You could eat it again the next night cold, straight from the refrigerator, and it tasted even better because the salt had worked its way deeper into the cabbage overnight. Seniors who grew up in row houses in Philadelphia and Baltimore and Boston ate this once a week as children and never stopped making it. Their mothers made it on paydays. Their grandmothers made it on any day. The recipe never changed because it never needed to. 1 can, half a cabbage, a pot of water, and enough patience to let it simmer. The taste was home. The price was survival. And the smell, that sweet, salty, cabbagey steam filling a small kitchen, was a signal to everyone in the house that dinner was ready and that someone still cared enough to make it. Number 14. Swiss steak. The name had nothing to do with Switzerland. It came from the technique of Swissing, an old textile term for running fabric through heavy rollers to flatten and smooth it. That was exactly what you did to the meat. You took a cheap, tough cut of round steak, laid it on a board, and pounded it with a meat mallet until the fibers broke down and the flour you pressed into both sides worked its way deep into the grain. Then you browned it hard in a hot skillet, laid it in a baking dish, covered it with canned tomatoes, sliced onions, and sometimes a diced green pepper, and baked it for 2 hours or more. The pounding and the long braising did what money could not. They turned a cut of beef that would have been too tough to chew into something tender enough to pull apart with the side of a fork. This was the meal families cooked when beef was on the table, but the budget only stretched to the cheapest piece in the case. The tomato sauce thickened around the meat as it baked, and by the time you pulled the dish out, the kitchen smelled like something slow and honest. You served it with mashed potatoes and poured the thick tomato pan sauce over everything on the plate. Swiss steak was one of the most common weeknight dinners in America for decades. It appeared in community cookbooks from coast to coast, and church suppers built whole menus around it. Today, most people under 50 have never heard the name. Number 27. Fried catfish platter. Cornmeal-crusted fillets dropped into a deep fryer until the outside cracked when you bit into it and the inside stayed white and flaky. This was the Friday special at almost every truck stop south of the Mason-Dixon line, and plenty of them served it every day of the week. The platter came with hush puppies, coleslaw, and a wedge of lemon that most drivers ignored. Tartar sauce in a little paper cup. The catfish came from ponds in Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas, and the cook who battered them had a cornmeal mix that never got written down. Just cornmeal, salt, pepper, and a pinch of cayenne. Number 7. Cabbage and noodle skillet. You shredded half a head of green cabbage, chopped 1 onion, melted 4 tablespoons of butter in a wide skillet, and cooked it slowly 25 minutes until the pan turned a sweet brown. You boiled half a pound of egg noodles separately, drained them, dumped them into the cabbage, salted heavily, peppered heavily, and ate it straight from the skillet. The dish came from Polish, Hungarian, and Slovak grandmothers who landed in western Pennsylvania between 1880 and 1925. A head of cabbage cost a nickel in 1934. It still costs less than $2. The cabbage is what a Johnstown family ate when the mill shut down in 1977. It still works. The heat had to stay low for the full 25 minutes. A hot pan turned the cabbage gray and sour. A patient pan caramelized the leaves and coated the noodles in a sweet, nutty glaze. Number 19. Cabbage rolls. In the coal towns of eastern Pennsylvania and the steel towns strung along the Ohio River Valley, cabbage rolls were not just a meal, they were an identity. Polish, Czech, Slovak, and Hungarian families brought the recipe across the Atlantic, and by the 1940s, cabbage rolls had become as American as the church basement where they were served. You boiled a whole head of cabbage until the leaves softened, then peeled them off one at a time, careful not to tear. The filling was ground beef or pork mixed with cooked rice, a little onion, salt, pepper, and sometimes a beaten egg to hold everything together. You rolled each leaf tight around a spoonful of filling, tucked the edges in like a small envelope, and packed them snug into a deep baking dish. The sauce was tomato, usually from a can, poured over the top before the whole thing went into the oven for an hour. 1 large head of cabbage and a pound of meat made enough rolls to feed 8 people, and the extras never stayed in the house. That was the thing about cabbage rolls. You never made them just for your own family. The leftovers went to the neighbor recovering from surgery, the widow at the end of the block, or the potluck table at St. Stanislaus on Sunday. Dorothy Sams, the woman from the opening of this video, made her cabbage rolls with pork because it was cheaper than beef in Pikeville, and she wrapped them in newspaper to keep them warm on the walk to the church hall. The whole batch cost her less than $1.50. It fed 30 people, and not a single roll came home. In New England, they called it American chop suey, and if you grew up anywhere else, the name means nothing, which is exactly how regional food names work. It has nothing to do with Chinese chop suey, and everyone in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut understood that and did not care. Elbow macaroni, ground beef, canned diced tomatoes, green pepper, onion, and a pinch of sugar, combined raw in a casserole, covered and baked until the pasta absorbed the tomato broth and the beef cooked through. The sugar is the regional signature. Without it, the tomatoes stay sharp. With it, the whole dish mellows to something that tasted exactly like the school cafeteria, and the school cafeteria tasted like home. A 1938 New England food survey documented American chop suey as one of the most common weeknight dinners in working-class households from Portland to Providence. Somewhere in New England, on any given Tuesday, somebody's grandmother is still sliding the same covered dish into the same oven, calling it the same name, and not explaining it to anyone. Number 14. Sloppy Joes. The origin story splits between two places: Sioux City, Iowa, 1926, where a cook named Joe at Floyd Angel's Cafe added tomato sauce to loose meat sandwiches, and Havana, Cuba, where a bar owner named Sloppy Joe Abial y Otero served ground beef sandwiches as early as 1917. By the 1950s, the name was everywhere, and the dish was in every school cafeteria in America. There was no manwich yet. That canned sauce did not arrive until 1969, made by Hunt's. In the 1950s, you made it from scratch. 1 pound of ground beef at 45 cents, an onion, ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, a tablespoon of brown sugar. You browned the meat, added the sauce, simmered it for 10 minutes, and spooned it onto hamburger buns that cost 20 cents a bag. The whole meal for a family of 4 cost under 90 cents. The beauty of a Sloppy Joe was that it solved the central problem of the 1950s kitchen. You had 1 pound of ground beef. You had 5 or 6 mouths to feed. You needed a way to make that single pound stretch across every plate and still feel like a real meal, not a compromise. The tomato sauce did the work. It turned a 1/4 pound of beef per person into a full sandwich that dripped down your wrists and stained your shirt and made children feel like they were eating something generous. In Topeka, Kansas, a school cafeteria cook named Betty Simmons served Sloppy Joes to 400 children every Wednesday for 12 years. She used 10 pounds of beef and 5 bottles of ketchup. The children lined up twice. She never ran out. That was the trick of the whole decade. Not the food itself, but the feeling it created. Abundance was a performance, and the best cooks in America knew exactly how to stage it from a 45-cent pound of ground beef and a squeeze of ketchup. Stuffed tomatoes were August on a plate. Large, ripe summer tomatoes hollowed out with a spoon, the insides chopped and combined with stale bread, dried herbs, a little butter-softened onion, then packed back in and baked until the filling set, and the tomato softened without losing its shape. The dish showed up in Depression-era home economics guides as a way to use both surplus garden tomatoes and day-old bread in a single step, and Italian immigrant communities had been making versions, pomodori ripieni, since the early 1900s. In American households through the 1940s and 50s, it became a light supper, set beside a piece of cold ham or a fried egg, requiring almost nothing to prepare and producing something that looked far more considered than it was. The tomato had to be ripe enough to yield. The bread had to be stale enough to absorb. A fresh loaf turned to paste. You used what was left from the week. Chili mac was what happened when leftovers became a second chance. It started with last night's chili, thick, spicy, and still holding its heat, stirred into freshly boiled elbow macaroni until it became something new entirely. The cheese, if there was any left in the fridge, went on top, melting just enough to hold everything together. The dish was quick, cheap, and full of life, a perfect fix for nights when time ran out and hunger could not wait. Kids loved it because it felt like comfort in a bowl. Moms loved it because it meant nothing was wasted. Every spoonful was hearty, familiar, and full of flavor that felt earned. It was thrift made joyful, proof that leftovers were not the end of the meal but the start of another. In homes where every dollar counted, Chili Mac stretched both food and gratitude farther than anyone thought possible. It was the weeknight hero of kitchen tables across America. Easy, satisfying, and always ready to save the day. The scent of chili mixed with noodles was as real as laughter, and every bite tasted like togetherness. It was what family looked like, messy, warm, and enough for everyone. Tomato gravy over rice was Southern poverty food that generations of seniors relied upon when the pantry was nearly bare, but dinner still needed to happen. The gravy started with bacon drippings heated in a skillet, then flour was stirred in to create a roux that cooked until golden. Canned tomatoes were added along with water to create a gravy that was tangy, rich, and deeply comforting. Sugar balanced the acidity while salt and pepper brought everything into focus. Poured over a mound of white rice, this simple combination became a meal that satisfied hunger without straining the budget. A single can of tomatoes and a cup of rice fed one person for 2 days, making it one of the most economical dinners possible. The dish carried memories of harder times, of grandmothers who knew how to make something from nothing. For seniors eating alone, tomato gravy over rice was both nostalgia and nourishment in a single skillet, proof that comfort could be measured in the simplest ingredients prepared with care. Number 26. Bean soup with a ham bone. After a Sunday ham dinner, the bone went into a stock pot with dried navy beans, a chopped onion, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. You let it simmer for hours. The marrow dissolved into the broth. The beans softened until they split apart. By Monday evening, you had a pot of soup thick enough to hold a spoon upright, and it tasted like the ham dinner all over again, only richer. This was the original zero-waste cooking. The bone that most people today would throw away was the foundation of an entire second meal. A pound of dried beans cost pennies, the onion cost less, and the bone was already paid for. In the 1950s, a quarter had weight. It could buy a loaf of bread, a quart of milk, or a pound of ground beef depending on where you lived and what day it was. A dinner built around that coin was not an act of desperation. It was an act of arithmetic. Mothers and grandmothers ran their kitchens like accountants, stretching every cut of meat, every bag of flour, every last spoonful of drippings saved in a coffee can beside the stove. The meals on this list came from that discipline. They were not creative cooking the way food magazines later defined it. They were survival made into craft, practiced so often that the measurements lived in muscle memory and the results never varied by more than a pinch. Number 19. Howard Johnson fried clam. Dinner. Howard Johnson was a name that meant something in the 1960s. Those orange-roofed restaurants lined the turnpikes and highways from Maine to Florida, and families planned road trips around stopping at one for fried clams and ice cream. So when Howard Johnson put their name on a frozen dinner, people paid attention. The fried clam platter was one of their signature offerings translated to the home freezer. The tray came with a pile of breaded clam strips, French fries, coleslaw, and a lemon wedge that was more decorative than functional after 30 minutes in a hot oven. The clam strips were small and heavily breaded, the kind where you ate 3 before you found an actual piece of clam, but the coating crisped up in the oven in a way most frozen dinners could not manage. Howard Johnson charged more than Swanson or Banquet because they were selling a restaurant name, and for a while it worked. People felt like they were eating restaurant food at home, even though the gap between the highway version and the frozen version was wide enough to drive a station wagon through. The frozen line expanded to include macaroni and cheese, chicken croquettes, and other restaurant staples. But Howard Johnson, the restaurant chain, started closing locations through the 1970s, and the frozen dinners lost their anchor. Without those orange roofs reminding people what the brand stood for, the trays stopped moving. The frozen line disappeared entirely. Today, the Howard Johnson name belongs to a budget hotel chain, and almost nobody remembers you could once pull a fried clam platter out of your home freezer with that same logo on the box. Number 22. Corned beef hash. Open the can, dump the hash into a skillet, press it flat with a spatula, and let the bottom crust up for about 5 minutes without touching it. That crust was the whole point. Without it, you had warm mush. With it, you had something that crunched when the fork went through. Some people cracked an egg on top and covered the skillet to let it steam. Others ate it plain with ketchup and a piece of white bread. A can of corned beef hash from the grocery store was one of the cheapest hot dinners you could put together in under 10 minutes. You did not need to add a thing to it. Open, fry, eat. 3 steps, no leftovers. Number 16. Tamale pie. This was not a tamale, and it was not really a pie. But nobody cared what you called it, because it disappeared from the dish before you could argue about the name. You browned ground beef with onion and chili powder, stirred in canned tomatoes and a handful of sliced black olives, and poured it into a casserole dish. Then you spread a thick layer of cornmeal batter over the top and baked it until the crust turned golden and pulled away from the edges. The cornmeal top cracked when you cut into it, and underneath was a thick, spicy, meaty filling that tasted like a tamale without any of the work. Church cookbooks across the Southwest printed this recipe so often the pages were stained with grease. 1 dish, 1 oven, no rolling corn husks, no steaming for hours. It was the shortcut that actually worked. Number 21. Fried chicken gizzards. Tough little bundles of muscle from the bird, boiled until they turned tender, then battered and fried until the outside went dark and crunchy. They came in a basket with fries and a cup of white gravy for dipping. Most people outside of the South had never eaten one, but drivers who ran routes through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi knew exactly what they were. The gizzard was the cheapest piece of the chicken, and a full basket cost under $1. The flavor was concentrated, deeper than a thigh, chewier than a wing. The drivers who loved them ordered them every single time they stopped. A truck driver in the 1970s burned through calories the way his rig burned through diesel. Not from heavy lifting, but from the strain of staying alert for 14, sometimes 16 hours behind the wheel. A truck stop meal had to do 2 things: fill the stomach fast and keep the driver going long enough to reach the next stop. That meant heavy proteins, thick gravies, and enough starch to slow digestion so a man felt full for hours. Light meals were for people who slept in their own beds. A driver needed weight on the plate. He needed food that sat in the gut and reminded him he was still a person, not just a pair of hands on a wheel. Number 15. Water pie. You whisked a cup and a half of water, a cup of sugar, 2 teaspoons of vanilla, 4 tablespoons of flour, and 4 pats of butter, then poured the lot into an unbaked shell. The first printed recipe ran in California in 1886, but the dish came back during the Depression when cooks had no eggs, no milk, and no excuse to skip dessert. The flour and the sugar set the water into a gelatinous custard in the oven, the butter floated to the top in beads of yellow, and the whole thing sliced clean once it cooled. Your great-grandmother served it at a wake in 1934 in West Virginia. Nobody knew it was made of water. They asked her for the recipe. She just smiled and lied. The chemistry is sugar binding water into syrup, then flour, gelating it into a sliceable solid past 200 degrees. You do not need to know any of that to bake one. You just need to trust the oven for 45 minutes and walk away. Number 12. Leftover hash. Whatever meat sat in the refrigerator from last night's dinner got chopped into rough cubes with cold boiled potatoes, diced onion, and a little bell pepper, then fried together in a cast iron skillet with enough bacon grease to build a proper crust on the bottom. Hash was not a recipe, it was a strategy. Roast beef hash, corned beef hash, ham hash from the Sunday leftovers. The whole skill was in that golden brown layer on the bottom of the pan, and getting it right took patience and a stubborn refusal to stir too early. A fried egg cracked on top was optional but strongly encouraged. Families in the 1950s ate hash at least once a week, and nobody ever called it leftovers when the children asked what was for dinner. Nobody outside the South knew what poppy seed chicken was, and that was part of how you knew you were in the right kitchen. Cooked chicken, shredded, never cubed, went into a baking dish, then a mixture of sour cream and cream of chicken soup poured over it, smooth and thick. Over the top went a full sleeve of crushed Ritz crackers mixed with melted butter and a tablespoon of poppy seeds pressed lightly into the cracker surface, baked until the crust went deep gold and the cream filling was bubbling at the edges. The poppy seeds are not for flavor. They are for texture and identity, and anyone who skips them has never made this the right way. The recipe circulated through Southern church suppers and community cookbooks throughout the 1960s, passed hand to hand without a printed name. She made it every time someone in the congregation was sick or grieving or had a new baby. You ate it at her table and never thought to write it down, and when she stopped bringing it, nobody could remember what had gone into it. Number 7. Hamburger skillet. Some called it American goulash. Others called it skillet macaroni and beef. In the Midwest, it was just goulash. In the South, it was skillet supper. The recipe appeared on Hunt's tomato sauce can labels in the 1950s. Home cooks recalled learning it from matchbook cover recipes advertising Hunt's sauce. 1 pound of ground beef, an onion, a green pepper, 2 cans of tomatoes, elbow macaroni, garlic salt, and chili powder. You browned the beef, added the vegetables and uncooked pasta, poured in the tomatoes, covered the skillet, and simmered for 20 minutes. The whole meal cost under $1. 1 pound of ground beef at 45 cents fed 4 to 6 people when you stretched it with pasta and tomatoes. The dish crossed every regional and class boundary in the country. It did not matter if you lived in a farmhouse in Nebraska or an apartment in the Bronx. If you had a skillet and a pound of ground beef, you had dinner. That simplicity was the whole point. Salmon patties on Friday nights were not optional, and not because anyone particularly loved them. Before Vatican II relaxed the rules in the early 1960s, Catholic families, and many households that simply followed the custom by habit, kept Friday as a meatless day. Canned salmon was the answer. It came from the Alaska and Pacific Northwest canneries operating since the 1880s, packed in flat oval tins at a price within reach of almost any household. You drained the liquid, mashed in the soft spine bones because your mother knew they were calcium, combined the salmon with cracker crumbs, beaten egg, a little onion, salt, and pepper, formed patties, and fried them in a cast iron skillet until both sides were deeply browned. Crisp on the outside, soft in the middle, smelling like the sea in a way that felt out of place in a landlocked kitchen. She made tartar sauce from scratch, mayonnaise, pickle relish, a squeeze of lemon if there was one. Every Friday, without variation, without complaint, without a recipe card in sight. Chicken cornbread casserole was the kind of dish that waited patiently in every mother's recipe box, ready to rescue a tired evening. It began with shredded chicken, often left over from Sunday dinner, mixed into a can of cream soup, and seasoned with just enough salt and pepper to taste like comfort itself. Over that went the cornbread mix, sweetened slightly, poured on thick, and baked until it rose golden and fragrant. The oven did most of the work while the kids finished homework or the washing machine spun in the next room. When it came out, the smell filled the house with something that felt like gratitude, buttery, warm, and steady. Slicing into it meant the end of a long day. The filling was creamy, soft, and rich from the soup, while the top was firm and crumbly in the best way. It was a small miracle of convenience and care, the kind of food that made you feel seen after a shift, after errands, after everything life could throw. Moms knew it was dependable. A casserole that did not need measuring cups, only memory. It fed everyone, left no one hungry, and always felt special even though it came from the simplest ingredients. This was not fast food. It was fast love, baked golden in a single pan. Potato and egg skillet was the meal that seniors turned to when the refrigerator held almost nothing but the pantry still needed to produce dinner. Leftover potatoes or freshly boiled ones were cubed and fried in bacon grease until the edges turned crispy and golden. Eggs were cracked directly into the skillet and stirred through the potatoes, cooking into soft curds that clung to every piece. Salt, pepper, and perhaps some dried onion flakes were the only seasonings needed to create something deeply comforting. The dish cost almost nothing. Potatoes were cheap by the bag and eggs were pennies apiece. Yet it provided complete protein and enough substance to satisfy real hunger. Many seniors remembered eating this during the Depression, when such simple combinations kept families alive. The crispy potato edges contrasted beautifully with the soft scrambled eggs, creating textures that made each bite interesting. Potato and egg skillet was proof that poverty cooking could still produce something genuinely delicious. Number 19. Potato soup. 5 or 6 potatoes peeled and cubed, dropped into a pot with a chopped onion, a couple stalks of celery, and enough water to cover. You let it boil until the potatoes were falling apart, then you added a generous pour of milk, a lump of butter, and salt and pepper. Some cooks mashed part of the potatoes against the side of the pot with a wooden spoon to thicken the broth while leaving the rest in chunks. Others ran a fork through the whole thing until it was smooth. Either way, the result was a bowl of soup so thick and warm that it could replace any other dish on a cold night. Potato soup was the meal of last resort in the best possible sense. When the paycheck was 3 days away and the cupboard was almost bare, there were always potatoes. They were cheap by the sack. They kept for weeks in a cool, dark place, and they stretched a meal further than almost any other vegetable. A pot of potato soup fed 4 people for a few cents, and nobody felt deprived eating it. In mining towns and mill towns, this was a regular Thursday or Friday dinner when the week's groceries were running low. The women who made it did not follow recipes. They adjusted by feel. More milk if the potatoes were starchy, more butter if the family needed something richer, a handful of shredded cheese stirred in at the end if there was any left in the icebox. The soup changed every time, but it always did the same thing. It told you someone cared enough to stand at the stove. Leftover potato soup went back on the burner the next day. It thickened overnight into something closer to a chowder, and some families preferred it that way. A single batch could carry a household through 2 or 3 meals without anyone feeling like they were eating the same thing twice. Number 16. Nighthawk Frozen Steak Dinner. Nighthawk was a Texas brand that did one thing and did it with conviction. They froze a real charcoal-broiled steak and put it in a box with a baked potato and a vegetable. No gravy, no sauce, no apologies. The steak was thin, but it was actual steak, not a pressed patty or a processed loaf shaped to resemble one. Nighthawk sold mostly in the South and Southwest, and the people who knew the brand were loyal to it in a way that national brands could never earn. The box showed a cowboy hat and a steak with grill marks, and the product inside came close enough to matching that promise. They stayed in business for decades, outlasting bigger brands in their region because they never tried to be anything other than a steak dinner in a box. When Nighthawk finally disappeared from store shelves, steak lovers in Texas noticed and mourned it like a neighbor who moved away. Number 17. Canned beef tamales. You pulled them out of the can still wrapped in their paper husks, peeled each one carefully so the masa did not stick, lined them up in a baking dish, and poured the chili sauce from the can over the top. Some people added shredded cheese or a spoonful of enchilada sauce before putting the dish in the oven for 20 minutes. The tamales came out soft and warm with the corn masa soaking up every drop of sauce. A single tall can held 6 tamales, enough for a full dinner with a side of rice or a handful of tortilla chips. Grocery stores across the Southwest and the Midwest stocked these by the case, and they disappeared off the shelf faster than almost any other canned meat product. People who grew up eating them can still describe the way the paper peeled away from the masa in one clean strip when the tamale was heated just right. Number 20. Creamed eggs on toast. You hard-boiled half a dozen eggs, peeled them, and chopped them into rough chunks. Then you made a white sauce in a saucepan, the same one you used for everything else. Butter, flour, and milk, stirred until it thickened. You folded the chopped eggs into the sauce and spooned the whole thing over slices of toast on a plate. Some families called it goldenrod eggs because of the color. Others just called it eggs on toast and moved on. The meal cost almost nothing and took 15 minutes. It showed up on Friday nights in Catholic homes and on any night the grocery money had run thin. You added salt and pepper and maybe a few canned peas on the side, and that was dinner. Nobody remembered it fondly. Everybody ate it. Number 19, spaghetti with meat sauce. This one surprises people. Italian food at a truck stop. But in the 1970s, spaghetti with meat sauce sat on more truck stop menus than pot roast, and it outsold most daily specials by the end of the week. The reason was simple. Ground beef was cheap, canned tomato sauce was cheaper, dried spaghetti noodles cost almost nothing. A cook could feed 40 drivers out of one stock pot and still have leftovers for the morning crew. The sauce started with ground beef browned in a heavy pot with onions and garlic, then cans of tomato sauce went in, sometimes a can of tomato paste to thicken it, and a shake of Italian seasoning from a jar on the shelf. The spaghetti was boiled in a separate pot, drained and plated with a ladle of meat sauce on top and a sprinkle of Parmesan from a green shaker can. A basket of garlic bread came with it, not real garlic bread. Sliced white bread, buttered and dusted with garlic salt, then run under the broiler until the edges browned. The whole plate cost $1.65 at a truck stop outside of Knoxville in 1976, and the drivers scraped the plate clean with the last piece of bread. The sauce held on the back burner all day, and the noodles sat in a steam tray, and assembling a plate took less than 2 minutes. For a kitchen running on one cook and one waitress, that speed was everything. Spaghetti night was the one night a driver could eat without worrying whether the cook knew what he was doing. You cannot ruin spaghetti! Number 18, Spam fried in a cast iron skillet. You opened the can with the pull tab, slid the pink loaf onto the board, sliced it 8 times against the grain, and laid the slices in a hot, dry skillet. Hormel introduced Spam in 1937 to move pork shoulder that nobody was buying. The 1940 Hormel Cookbook listed 50 ways to cook it. By the end of World War II, the United States military had received over 150 million pounds of Spam, and every soldier coming home had an opinion. Some men hated it. Most kept eating it on a Sunday morning for life because it was the cheapest hot meat in the store and lasted on a shelf 2 years. Your grandfather fried it in lard with eggs and never apologized. The sugar and sodium nitrite in the Hormel recipe gave the surface a dark caramel crust on cast iron. A single 12-ounce can sliced 8 ways fed 3, but you had to slice it thin. Thin meat looked like more meat. Tuna noodle casserole got the fame, but the salmon noodle casserole fed just as many families and left far quieter when it went. The method was nearly identical: egg noodles, cream of celery soup, frozen peas, potato chip topping. But in place of tuna went a can of pink salmon, flaked and folded through the noodles with a light hand. The salmon brought a slightly richer flavor, a faint oceanic depth that disappeared into the cream of celery and peas, but was present if you were paying attention. Nobody was paying attention. They were eating because it was 6:30 and the table was set, and this was what there was. When frozen fish portions and fast food arrived through the 1970s and 80s, canned salmon stopped being a pantry first choice, and this casserole quietly disappeared from weeknight rotations. One winter, she made it. The next winter, something else was in the dish. That was how it ended. Not with ceremony, just with a different can in a different hand. Number 12, Hoppin' John. The oldest published recipe appeared in The Carolina Housewife by Sarah Rutledge in 1847. The dish originated with the Gullah people of the South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry, descended from enslaved West Africans who brought both the recipe and the black-eyed pea crop to the Americas. By the 1950s, it was a one-pot tradition across the entire South. Dried black-eyed peas at 10 cents, a smoked ham hock at 20 cents, onion, garlic, and long-grain rice. You simmered the peas with the ham hock until tender, added the rice, covered the pot, and waited. The whole meal for 6 people cost under 60 cents. The ham hock was the cheapest pork cut available, essentially a bone with collagen and scraps. The dish encoded in its ingredients the resourcefulness of generations of families who had built an entire cuisine from what others threw away. On New Year's Day, eating Hoppin' John meant good luck. Collard greens meant money. Cornbread meant gold. The tradition was old enough that nobody remembered who started it. They just did it. City chicken had no chicken in it, which was the whole point of the name. In Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit, in the Polish and Ukrainian neighborhoods that grew up around the steel mills in the 1930s and 40s, fresh chicken cost more per pound than pork shoulder or veal. So butcher counters in those neighborhoods sold cubed pork and veal already threaded on wooden skewers, shaped roughly to resemble a drumstick, and working families took them home, breaded them in seasoned flour and egg and breadcrumbs, browned them in a skillet, then finished them covered in the oven with a little broth. The imitation that tasted good enough that people stopped thinking of it as imitation. By the 1950s, it appeared in junior league cookbooks from Pennsylvania to Illinois under its real name, no longer embarrassed by its origins. The pork stayed juicy under the breading. The veal, when you could find it, went silky at the center. You pulled it off the stick with your teeth, and nobody called it anything other than dinner. Chicken fricassee arrived in American kitchens wearing a French name and hiding the fact that it was simply stewed chicken and cream gravy, which made it more appealing, not less. The dish had French Acadian roots that ran through Louisiana and up through the mid-Atlantic states, but by the time it reached the average household in the 1940s and 50s, it had been stripped of its regional accent and turned into something any home cook could manage on a Wednesday. You cut a whole chicken into pieces, browned them in butter, then added flour to the drippings, stock, and a cup of cream. Covered and simmered low for 40 minutes until the meat was fall-apart tender and the sauce had thickened to something you wanted to soak a biscuit in. Served over egg noodles or rice, it fed a family of 5 without cost or complaint. It disappeared quietly when boneless chicken breasts became the default cut in the 1980s and nobody had a whole bird to start with anymore. Sausage and cabbage skillet was the one-pan wonder that turned thrift into art. A single link of sausage, sliced thin, met a pile of cabbage that wilted down into tenderness, flavored by onions and a touch of pepper. The smell was sharp, smoky, and comforting all at once. It cooked fast but tasted slow, the kind of dish that tasted better than it had any right to. Moms liked it because it stretched what little meat they had into a meal that could fill everyone's plate. The cabbage soaked up all the flavor, and the sausage gave it heart. It was the definition of economy. No waste, no rush, just a skillet and a bit of love. Steam filled the kitchen windows, and the air felt alive. This dish proved that patience and seasoning could make miracles from scraps. Every bite carried pride, and every pan told a story of strength. Chicken liver and onions was an old-fashioned delicacy that seniors cherished for both its rich flavor and remarkable nutritional value. Chicken livers cost almost nothing at the butcher counter, often sold for pennies per pound because younger generations had forgotten how to appreciate them. The livers were dusted with seasoned flour and fried quickly in bacon drippings until the outside developed a golden crust while the inside stayed creamy. Sliced onions were cooked in the same fat until soft and caramelized, then piled over the livers like a sweet, savory blanket. The combination was intensely flavorful, rich, mineral, and deeply satisfying in a way that chicken breast could never match. A half-pound of livers fed one person generously, providing iron and B vitamins that doctors recommended for elderly patients. The dish came together in under 15 minutes and required nothing more than a hot skillet. Chicken liver and onions represented a time when nothing was wasted and flavor was prized above convenience. Number 17. Red beans and rice. Dried red kidney beans soaked overnight, then simmered all day with a ham hock, onion, celery, bell pepper, garlic, and bay leaves. The beans cooked down until they were creamy and thick, and you spooned them over a mound of white rice. This was a Monday tradition in New Orleans because Monday was wash day, and the beans could simmer unattended while the laundry hung on the line. But red beans and rice traveled far beyond Louisiana. Families across the South made their own versions with whatever smoked meat they had on hand. The beans were cheap, the rice was filler, and the ham hock gave the whole pot a deep smoky flavor that tasted like it took more effort than it did. Number 15. Bird's Eye International Dinners. Bird's Eye tried something different in the 1960s. Instead of the standard American meat and potatoes layout, they offered themed dinners inspired by other countries, a Japanese-style teriyaki dinner, an Italian dinner with lasagna, a French dinner with crepes. Each tray came in packaging designed to look worldly, with illustrations of foreign landscapes and promises of authentic cuisine. None of it was authentic. The teriyaki was sweet and thick and tasted nothing like anything served in Tokyo. The French dinner was a crepe filled with cream sauce and chicken in proportions that would make a French cook walk out of the room. But in a decade when most Americans had never eaten actual Japanese or French food, these trays offered the illusion of worldliness for pocket change. Birdseye pulled the entire line when real international restaurants started opening in American cities, and the comparison became embarrassing. The freezer aisle in 1965 was 3 feet wide and 6 feet long in most grocery stores. The selection was small and the competition was fierce. Swanson, Banquet, Morton, and a handful of regional brands fought for that limited space with box art that showed meals no one would ever pull from the tray inside. The turkey on the box was golden and glistening. The turkey in the tray was gray and gelatinous. Everyone knew the gap existed, and nobody complained because the transaction was understood. You were not buying the meal on the box. You were buying 25 minutes of not cooking. You were buying a clean kitchen and a quiet evening. The food industry figured this out before anyone put it in those words. Convenience was the product. The turkey was just the wrapper it came in. And for one full decade, that bargain held without anyone objecting loud enough to matter. Number 10. Canned beef stew over rice. Dinty Moore was the name most people reached for. You opened the can, heated the stew in a saucepan, and ladled it over a bowl of cooked white rice. The rice doubled the volume of the meal without adding any cost beyond a handful of dry grains. The stew had potatoes, carrots, chunks of beef, and a thick brown gravy that clung to everything it touched. It was not elegant, but it was a complete dinner in a single can. The rice underneath absorbed the gravy and turned every bite into something that filled you up and kept you full until morning. Seniors who cooked for themselves knew this trick. The stew alone left you looking for seconds. The stew over rice left you pushing back from the table. 1 can of Dinty Moore and a scoop of rice. That was a Wednesday night solved. Number 21. Hamburger gravy on biscuits. You browned ground beef in a skillet, sprinkled flour over the meat, and stirred in milk until you had a thick, pale gravy studded with crumbled hamburger. Salt, pepper, and nothing else. Then you split open a hot biscuit and spooned the gravy over both halves until it ran down the sides and pooled on the plate. Some families used canned biscuits. Others made them from scratch with lard and buttermilk. Either way, the meal took 15 minutes from cold skillet to table. This was payday -3 food. The kind of supper that used one ingredient stretched with flour and milk into something that stuck to your ribs and kept you full through the night. Men who worked road crews and factory floors ate this twice a week without complaint. It filled the same hole a roast would have filled at a fraction of the cost. In most American homes in the 1950s, dinner was not a decision. It was a schedule. Monday was meatloaf. Tuesday was something from a can. Wednesday was whatever the butcher had marked down. Thursday was leftovers rearranged into a casserole. Friday was fish if you were Catholic and pancakes if you were not. Saturday was hamburgers or hot dogs. Sunday was the only meal anyone planned with any real intention. Nobody scrolled through recipes. Nobody asked the family what they were in the mood for. The woman running that kitchen knew what she had in the refrigerator and how far she could stretch it until payday. That rotation was not boring. It was a system built on knowing exactly what you could afford and making it last. The meals on this list came out of that rotation. They were never exciting. They were always there. Number 25, turkey dinner plate. Sliced roast turkey with brown gravy, cornbread dressing, cranberry sauce from the can, and green beans that had been cooking all day with salt pork. This was not Thanksgiving. This was a Tuesday in October at a truck stop off the I-40 in Tennessee. The turkey came from a roasting pan that held 2 whole birds, and the cook carved to order until the birds ran out. The dressing was baked in a sheet pan and cut into squares. The cranberry sauce held the shape of the can, ridged and wobbling on the plate. Nobody complained. A turkey dinner plate in the middle of the week felt like a holiday, and drivers who spotted it on the specials board did not think twice. Number 11. Cornmeal mush fried in lard. You stirred a cup of yellow cornmeal into 4 cups of boiling salted water, cooked it 15 minutes until it pulled from the sides, poured it into a loaf pan, and cooled it overnight in the icebox. The next morning, you sliced it 1/2 inch thick, fried the slices in a tablespoon of lard until the outside was a dark mahogany crust, and ate them with butter, sorghum, or a fried egg on top. Your grandfather grew up on this in Pennsylvania Dutch country in the 1920s, and so did half of the Midwest. 1 pound of cornmeal cost 6 cents in 1932 and fed 6 for 2 days. The genius is the pause. You cook it once and eat it 3 different ways across 2 days. Fewer dishes, less wood, more meals. And the cooling step was non-negotiable. A warm slab turned to pudding. A cold one held its shape like a Tuscan polenta cake. Number 11. Biscuits and sausage gravy. Homemade biscuits, the real kind made with white lily flour and cold lard, cut out with an upside-down drinking glass because nobody in the house owned an actual biscuit cutter. While they baked, you browned a roll of Jimmy Dean pork sausage in a cast-iron skillet, crumbled it fine, and sprinkled flour right over the cooked meat without draining a drop of grease. You stirred until the flour soaked into the fat, then poured whole milk in slowly while scraping the bottom of the pan, and a thick white gravy formed with little bits of browned sausage suspended throughout. Split the hot biscuits open on the plate and drown them. This was breakfast food turned into supper, and nobody in Eastern Tennessee saw a single thing wrong with that. A tube of sausage and a batch of biscuits fed a whole family for less than what a drive-through combo meal costs today, and the gravy was the part that mattered. It turned 3 biscuits into a full dinner that tasted like somebody's kitchen on a cold Saturday morning. Something changed in American grocery stores between 1970 and 1990 that nobody really talks about. The ingredients that made cheap cooking possible quietly disappeared or tripled in price. Oxtails went from throwaway scraps to specialty cuts behind the meat counter. Lard vanished from the baking aisle entirely. Whole chickens gave way to boneless, skinless breasts wrapped in plastic and sold at 4 times the cost per pound. The dinners on this list were born in a time when a family could walk into the store with $5 and walk out with enough food for the week. That time is gone. What replaced it was convenience packaging, and convenience always costs more than the thing it replaced. The real loss was not just the price. It was that an entire generation never learned to stretch $1 across a dinner table the way their grandmothers did without thinking. Before a mandolin appeared in any kitchen you ever stood in, there was a sharp knife and patient slicing, because the thinner the potato, the more surface there was to absorb the sauce, and the more surface, the better the dish. Ham and scalloped potatoes did not come from a cookbook. They came from the Monday after Easter, when half a bone-in ham still sat in the refrigerator. Thin sliced potatoes first, diced ham and sliced onion, a second potato layer, then a simple roux sauce, butter and flour, then whole milk whisked until thick, salt and black pepper. Covered low for an hour, uncovered for the last 20 minutes to brown. The rule: if the knife passed through the top layer without resistance, it was done. No thermometer, just the knife. By the 1940s and 50s, this was one of the most reproduced casseroles in Midwestern home economics programs, a model of cost-efficient protein extension that turned a weekend ham into a weeknight centerpiece without either losing dignity. Number 8. Chicken and dumplings. The dish had roots in 19th century Appalachian and Low Country cooking. Lettuce Bryan published a version with sweat dumplings in the Kentucky Housewife in 1839. Marion Cabell Tyree included stewed chicken with biscuit dumplings in housekeeping in Old Virginia in 1879. By the 1950s, it was the comfort meal of the entire South. You simmered a whole chicken in a pot with onion, celery, and carrot for 90 minutes until the meat fell off the bone. You pulled the chicken out, stripped the meat, and dropped spoonfuls of dough into the simmering broth. Flour, baking powder, salt, milk, and a tablespoon of shortening. You covered the pot and steamed the dumplings for 15 minutes. The whole meal for 6 people cost about $1.10. A single chicken at 29 cents a pound fed a family because the dumplings turned broth into a meal. That was the economics of it. But the cultural weight went deeper. In East Tennessee, a woman named Opal Sizemore made chicken and dumplings every Sunday from 1948 until 1973. She used a 3-pound hen, a cup of flour, and nothing else but salt. Her pot fed her husband, 4 children, and whoever showed up at the door. She never measured anything. She never wrote it down. When she died, her daughter tried to make it and could not get the dumplings right. This was the dish Southern grandmothers brought to doorsteps when someone was grieving. They carried it in covered pots across neighborhoods in Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Carolinas. The dumpling style, whether you rolled them flat and cut them into ribbons or dropped them by spoon into fluffy clouds, was a matter of fierce regional identity that families argued about like religion. And the argument was never really about technique. It was about whose grandmother was right, whose kitchen smelled better on a Sunday afternoon, whose memory of that particular pot, carried to a neighbor whose husband had just died, was the one that mattered most. The dumplings were flour and milk. The meaning was something else entirely. That meaning is what disappeared, not the recipe. The recipe is in every cookbook in the South. What disappeared was the woman who made it without looking at one. If scalloped potatoes made Monday manageable, American goulash, or Johnny Marzetti, depending on which side of Ohio you grew up on, made Wednesday disappear entirely. Elbow macaroni, browned ground beef, canned tomatoes, cooked together in one pot until the pasta absorbed most of the sauce and everything went sticky at the edges. The name came from Teresa Marzetti, who ran a restaurant in Columbus, Ohio in the 1920s and served a baked version that spread through Midwest community cookbooks and school cafeteria programs for 50 years. By the 1950s, some version appeared on nearly every school lunch tray in the state. Johnny Marzetti in Ohio, American chop suey in New England, goulash everywhere else. The same dish, renamed by whoever got there first. At home, the trick was in the waiting. Right off the stove, it was good. The next day, cold from the refrigerator with the macaroni swollen and the sauce thickened into something almost solid, it was better. The kids who knew that were the ones who got there first in the morning. Turkey and rice skillet was a weeknight lifesaver, the kind of dinner that could appear from almost nothing. It began with bits of leftover turkey, chopped fine and browned in a single pan, with a handful of frozen vegetables, peas, carrots, corn, whatever was on hand. A scoop of rice went in next, soaking up every bit of flavor as it simmered with a little broth. The scent was soft and homey, the kind that filled the kitchen with quiet reassurance. Nothing about it was fancy, but everything about it worked. Moms leaned on it when time was short and energy was low, knowing it could feed a family for pennies. The rice puffed up tender, the vegetables brightened with salt and butter, and the turkey gave just enough richness to make it feel complete. It was balance in a skillet, light but satisfying, simple but full of heart. Some added soy sauce or onion powder to stretch its flavor. Others kept it plain, letting the rice and turkey speak for themselves. It tasted like peace after a long day, proof that even the most ordinary ingredients could make something wonderful when stirred with love. Creamed peas on toast was a gentle meal that seniors loved for its soft textures and mild, comforting flavor. A can of sweet peas was drained and folded into a simple white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, creating something that looked plain but tasted like pure comfort. The creamy sauce clung to each pea, transforming the humble vegetable into something that felt almost luxurious. Spooned over toast, preferably slightly stale bread that had been toasted crisp, the dish became a complete meal that was easy to chew and gentle on aging digestive systems. A single can of peas and 2 slices of bread fed one person adequately, costing mere pennies. The dish could be made richer with a hard-boiled egg chopped through or a sprinkle of cheese melted on top. Creamed peas on toast represented a gentler time when meals didn't need to be bold or exciting. sometimes soft, warm, and familiar, was exactly what the body and soul needed after a long day alone. Number 25. Stewed tomatoes on toast. A can of whole tomatoes poured into a saucepan with a spoonful of butter, a pinch of sugar, and salt. You let them simmer until they broke apart into a thick, chunky sauce, then spooned them over slices of toasted bread. The toast soaked up the juice and turned soft underneath, while the edges stayed firm enough to hold. This was a supper that Catholic families made on Fridays, and penny-pinching households made any night the meat ran out. Some cooks stirred in a beaten egg at the end to stretch it further. Others tore the bread into pieces and let it cook right in the pot. It looked like nothing on the plate, but it tasted like a garden in August, and it cost so little that nobody ever thought to write the recipe down. Number 8. Swanson Fried Chicken Dinner. This was the bestseller. For most of the 1960s, the fried chicken tray outsold every other dinner Swanson made. A piece of dark meat chicken, breaded and fried before freezing, next to mashed potatoes and corn or peas. The chicken was small enough to eat in 4 bites, but the breading was thick, and the seasoning was good enough to bring people back week after week. Swanson used dark meat because it held up better through the freeze and reheat cycle. White meat dried out. Dark meat stayed moist under its coating even after sitting in a home freezer for weeks. The mashed potatoes were the same instant flakes across the whole Swanson line, and the vegetable was an afterthought that nobody bought this dinner for. They bought it for the chicken, and the chicken delivered. The original Swanson fried chicken dinner in that aluminum tray, with its thick breading and honest dark meat portion, stopped being made decades ago. What sits in the freezer aisle today under the same name bears no resemblance to what made it a bestseller. Number 12. Treat and macaroni skillet. Treat was the other luncheon meat, the one that sat on the shelf next to Spam but cost a few cents less. You cubed it, fried it until the edges crisped, and tossed it with cooked elbow macaroni and a squeeze of ketchup or a splash of canned tomato sauce. The whole skillet came together in about 12 minutes. No oven, no baking dish, no waiting. Treat had a softer texture than Spam, almost like a firm pate, and it browned differently, more golden than crispy. Paired with macaroni, it made a one-pan dinner that required exactly 0 skill and generated exactly 1 dirty dish. Seniors on tight budgets bought Treat specifically because those few pennies mattered when you were counting every coin at the register. Number 15. Ham and lima bean casserole. Leftover ham cut into cubes, frozen lima beans, and a can of cream of mushroom soup. You mixed everything together in a baking dish, topped it with buttered breadcrumbs, and baked it until the edges bubbled. The mushroom soup was the sauce, which meant you did not need to make a roux or measure anything beyond opening a can. Lima beans were everywhere in the 1950s. They showed up in casseroles, soups, and side dishes because they were cheap and available frozen year-round. Most children hated them. Most mothers served them anyway. This casserole was the dinner nobody asked for and nobody complained about. It filled the plate, it used up the ham, and it was done in 40 minutes. By the late 1950s, frozen dinners started showing up in grocery stores, and the promise was hard to resist. A full meal on a tray, ready in 20 minutes, no planning required. Swanson put a turkey dinner in an aluminum tray and called it a television dinner, and within a few years, the entire idea of cooking from scratch on a weeknight started to feel old-fashioned. The meals on this list did not disappear because they tasted bad. They disappeared because they took time, and time was the one thing the modern kitchen was designed to eliminate. A casserole that baked for an hour, lost to a tray that heated in 20 minutes. A soup that simmered all afternoon, lost to a can that opened in 2 seconds. The trade was speed for flavor, and most families made it without looking back. What they gave up was not just a recipe. It was the smell of a kitchen that had been working all day. Number 15. Beef stew. Chunks of chuck roast, quartered potatoes, sliced carrots, and celery in a thick brown gravy, seasoned with nothing fancier than salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. The stew lived on the back of the stove and got better every hour. A morning batch tasted fine by noon and perfect by 6 in the evening. The meat broke down until it barely held together, and the potatoes absorbed the gravy and turned almost translucent around the edges. You got a bowl with a biscuit or 2 slices of white bread for sopping. Some stops charged 75 cents for a bowl and $1 for a plate over rice. The cheapest hot dinner on the menu and the hardest one to ruin. Before the interstate system, truck stops grew up on 2-lane highways at the edges of small towns. The cook was usually the owner. The waitress was usually the owner's wife. The food came from the same farms and butcher shops that fed the town. When the interstates opened in the late 1950s and 1960s, the old 2-lane stops started dying. The big new plazas at interchange exits ran on volume, not character. They bought from national distributors. They standardized the menu. A driver could stop at a plaza in Oklahoma and get the same frozen patty he got in Virginia. By 1980, the independent truck stop was vanishing, and with it went the cook who seasoned by feel, the waitress who remembered your name, and the daily special that changed because the cook made whatever he felt like making that morning. Number 14. Vinegar pie. You stirred half a cup of white vinegar into hot water, added a cup of sugar, 2 beaten eggs, 3 tablespoons of flour, a pat of butter, and a pinch of nutmeg. What came out of the oven tasted like a lemon meringue pie that had never seen a lemon. Vinegar pie traveled on wagon trains from Tennessee to Oregon and fed Laura Ingalls Wilder's family on the Dakota Prairie. The acid bit. The sugar covered it. The custard set in 25 minutes at 350. Your great-grandmother called it desperation pie. She made it on a Sunday when the preacher was coming. He asked for 2 slices, and the genius was the temperature of the water before the vinegar went in. The hot water dissolved the sugar all the way through, and only then did the cold acid hit, which kept the egg from scrambling on contact and gave the custard its silky texture. She brought the kettle to a near boil before she started. Number 21. Cream chipped beef on toast. The military called it something unprintable, and the veterans who came home from the Second World War and Korea kept making it anyway. You tore dried beef into thin strips, fried it in butter, stirred in enough flour to make a paste, and then added milk slowly until the whole thing thickened into a white gravy. Pour it over a piece of toast, and you had a meal that stuck with you all day long. The Armour brand sold jars of chipped beef for less than a can of tuna, and 1 jar made enough gravy for 4 plates. It looked like something from a hospital cafeteria in 1952, but the flavor was salty and rich and deeply savory, and men who learned to eat it in the barracks kept serving it to their own children for 20 years after the uniform came off. Nobody called it meal planning. Nobody called it food insecurity. In the 1950s and 1960s, the kitchen was just the room where you solved the problem of keeping everyone fed, and you solved it with whatever you had. A bag of dried beans, half a head of cabbage, a ham bone the butcher was about to toss. The women who ran these kitchens did not follow recipes. They followed instinct and arithmetic. How many mouths? How many days until payday? How much flour is left in the canister? And the meals they built in that narrow space between nothing and just enough became the real foundation of American home cooking. Not the magazine version with garnished plates and copper pots. The version where dinner cost 40 cents, the table was set by 6, and nobody in the house went to bed hungry. Cheesy chicken and hash brown casserole arrived when the freezer section became a pantry. Frozen, shredded hash browns, the bag in the bottom of the freezer since the last big breakfast, were the entire starch, tumbled into a dish still partly frozen, then covered with shredded rotisserie chicken, sour cream, cream of chicken soup, shredded cheddar, and salt. No pre-cooking, no thawing, no browning. $3.50 for an hour. The hash browns cooked in steam from the sour cream and soup. The chicken absorbed the potato fat, and the cheddar went crispy at the edges. Through the 1970s, as frozen foods became standard pantry items, this assembly cooking replaced the labor of peeling and slicing that earlier potato casseroles required. She probably learned it from a church cookbook or the back of the Ore-Ida bag, and once she did, she never went back to fresh potatoes. That version, the easy one done in 10 minutes flat, is the one you remember, and she is not here to make it anymore. Number 21. Hash brown skillet with ground beef. This was the meal American men cooked when their wives were not home. It required no recipe and no finesse. Ground beef, diced potatoes, an onion, and whatever canned vegetable was in the pantry. You fried it all together in a cast-iron skillet until the potatoes were crispy. The whole thing cost about 80 cents. By 1955, Westerns dominated American television. Gunsmoke premiered that September. Wagon Train followed in 1957. Cowboy-themed recipes started appearing in women's magazines, and skillet hash got a new name: ranch skillet, cowboy supper, trail pan. The food was the same. The marketing was different. A man standing over a cast-iron skillet felt like something out of a frontier story, even if he was standing in a kitchen in Levittown. It was the only meal in the 1950s that men took credit for cooking. Everything else belonged to the women. This one, for some reason, belonged to the cowboys. Navy bean and ham bone soup started the night before, always, because dried beans were not something you rushed. A pound of navy beans went into a pot covered with cold water and left on the counter overnight, swelling in the dark. The ham bone from Sunday went in the next morning with the soaked beans covered with fresh water, set on the back burner to simmer all day. No recipe, no ratio. You added an onion, a bay leaf, maybe a carrot if one was in the cold box. By 4 in the afternoon, the broth had gone deep and cloudy and the meat had come off the bone in long shreds. You fished out the bone, pulled the meat, stirred it back in, salted until it was right. Ham and bean soup was Monday in the South and Midwest for generations, built on the understanding that Sunday's celebration fed Tuesday's working week and that nothing left the kitchen until it had given everything it had. Oven barbecue chicken legs were the sticky glory of weeknight dinners. They started with a pack of drumsticks, cheap, meaty, and always enough for everyone. The sauce came from a bottle, sweet and tangy, sometimes mixed with a splash of vinegar or brown sugar to make it taste homemade. The smell hit first, smoky, sweet, and slow-baked until the sauce turned thick and glossy. The skin crisped just right, caramelizing at the edges while the meat stayed tender underneath. It was a dinner made with no fuss, just trust in the oven's quiet work. The sound of that first bite, the pull of tender chicken against the glaze, was the sound of reward. Moms loved it because it fed many without costing much. It filled bellies, brought people to the table, and left sticky smiles behind. The kind of meal you lick your fingers after, grateful for the simple goodness of it all. The sauce left rings on the plates and napkins, proof of joy and appetite. The leftovers were even better, cold or reheated, eaten standing at the stove the next day. It was the kind of food that asked for nothing more than a paper towel and a moment of peace, the kind every working mother deserved. Ham and scalloped potatoes baked together in a single dish created the kind of meal that felt fancy despite its humble ingredients. Leftover ham, often purchased as a marked-down end piece from the deli counter, was cubed and layered with thinly sliced potatoes in a deep skillet or baking dish. A simple white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk was poured over everything before the dish went into the oven to bake until the potatoes were tender and the top turned golden brown. The ham released its salty, smoky flavor into the creamy sauce while the potatoes absorbed everything, becoming impossibly rich and satisfying. A small ham piece and a few potatoes fed one senior for 3 or 4 meals, making it economical despite its indulgent taste. The dish required time in the oven but minimal hands-on effort, perfect for those who needed to rest while dinner cooked itself. Ham and scalloped potatoes represented the best of vintage cooking. Simple ingredients elevated through technique into something that felt like celebration. Number 14. American goulash. Elbow macaroni, ground beef, canned tomatoes, and onion all cooked together in one pot until the pasta absorbed the sauce and the whole thing turned into a thick, saucy mass that held its shape on a plate. Real Hungarian goulash has paprika, caraway, and no pasta at all. The American version threw all of that out and kept only the name. What replaced it was pure Midwestern practicality, a one-pot meal that used cheap ingredients, required no training, and produced enough food to serve 6 or 8 people without complaint. American goulash had a dozen regional names. In some towns, it was called slumgullion. In others, it was Johnny Marzetti, after a restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, that served a baked version with cheese on top. The recipe was almost identical everywhere. Brown the beef, cook the noodles, add the tomatoes, stir it together. The only variation was what else went into the pot: a can of corn, a diced green pepper, a shake of Worcestershire sauce. None of those additions changed the fundamental character of the dish, which was volume and flavor at minimal cost. Families who made this once a week for years rarely thought of it as a recipe. It was closer to a reflex. A pound of ground beef, a box of elbows, and a large can of tomatoes could appear on the table in under 30 minutes, and the leftovers kept well for days. In school cafeterias across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, goulash was a lunchtime staple served in bulk because the math worked. Feed hundreds of children with a few cases of ground beef and pasta, and the cost per plate stayed well under a dime. The name might have been borrowed. The dish itself was as American as the kitchens that produced it. Number 20. Swanson Swiss Steak Dinner. Swiss steak had nothing to do with Switzerland. It was a tough cut of beef pounded flat with a meat mallet, braised in tomato sauce, and served with whatever vegetables were cheap that season. Swanson turned it into a frozen dinner with the steak in a reddish tomato gravy, mashed potatoes, and a vegetable medley that was mostly corn. The steak was thin and chewy, but the tomato sauce made up for it. Families who grew up eating Swiss steak at home recognized this dinner as a passable imitation. Families who did not grow up thinking, this is what Swiss steak was supposed to taste like. Swanson phased it out as newer options took over the limited freezer shelf space. The name alone confused a generation, and then it was gone. Number 24. Sardines on toast. You opened the flat tin, laid the little fish across a piece of buttered toast, squeezed a few drops of lemon juice if you had half a lemon in the refrigerator, and ate them with a fork. The sardines were salty, oily, and rich enough to fill you up on 2 slices of bread and nothing else. Some people mashed them with a fork and spread them flat like a paste. Others left them whole and ate each one in 2 careful bites. A tin of sardines could sit in the pantry for years without going bad, and when you finally cracked it open, dinner was ready before the kettle finished boiling. This was old country food, the kind of supper that Portuguese and Italian grandparents brought over and never stopped making. Simple, fast, and filling enough to carry you through the night on pocket change. Number 22. American chop suey, elbow macaroni, ground beef, canned tomatoes, and a diced green pepper. That was the whole thing. You browned the beef, added the vegetables, stirred in the cooked noodles, and served it in bowls like pasta with ambition. In New England, they called it American chop suey. In the Midwest, it went by goulash. Down south, it barely had a name at all. The dish had nothing to do with Chinese cooking. The name stuck because anything tossed together fast with whatever you had counted as chop suey in the American imagination of the time. It tasted better the next day, reheated in a skillet with a little extra tomato stirred through. Most families made it once a week and never wrote down the recipe. Number 9. Fried clam strips. Breaded strips of clam meat fried until they curled up and turned golden, served in a basket with tartar sauce and fries. This was a New England and Mid-Atlantic truck stop item that drivers from other regions either loved or had never heard of. The clam strips came frozen in 5-pound boxes from distributors that supplied every stop from Maine to Maryland. They were not fresh. Nobody pretended they were. But fried and salted and dipped in tartar sauce, they had a briny chew that tasted like the coast even when you were 200 miles inland. Drivers who hauled freight through the Northeast knew every stop that carried them and planned their breaks around it. Number 19. American chop suey. You browned a pound of ground beef with a chopped onion, added a can of tomato sauce and a can of stewed tomatoes, stirred in 2 cups of cooked elbow macaroni, and called it dinner. New England called it chop suey. Michigan called it goulash. In Pittsburgh, your father called it Tuesday. The earliest printed recipe goes back to 1909. The version your grandmother knew came from a 1958 cookbook that added bacon and green peppers and stretched the pan to 6 people. But that is the working definition of genius. cheap, filling, shameless. And the real engineering inside the bowl was the elbow macaroni itself, because the curl of the noodle held a tablespoon of tomato sauce on its own, which meant a single spoonful delivered three things at once: the meat, the starch, and the sauce. Number 15. Buttered egg noodles. A bag of wide egg noodles boiled until soft, drained in a colander, and tossed back in the pot with a generous lump of real butter, salt, and black pepper. That was the entire meal. Sometimes you stirred in a handful of frozen peas or a spoonful of sour cream, but the plain version was what children in the 1970s actually asked for by name. Egg noodles cost less than spaghetti at most grocery stores, and a single bag filled 4 bowls without complaint. The texture was softer and richer than regular pasta because of the egg in the dough, and the melted butter clung to every wide strand in a way that margarine never could quite manage. This was the dinner mothers made on nights when nobody felt like cooking, but everyone still felt like eating. Red beans and rice on Monday was not a recipe in New Orleans, it was a calendar fact. Monday was wash day, requiring hours of labor, so Monday dinner had to take care of itself. Beans into the pot in the morning, smoked sausage added by noon, rice going in late, everything collapsing into a thick sauce with very little oversight. The oven version carries the same logic. Soaked dried kidney beans, sliced smoked sausage, long grain rice, and spiced chicken broth, cayenne, garlic powder, a bay leaf, covered at 325 for 2 hours. The sausage bleeds smoke into the broth, the rice absorbs from below, and the beans thicken the liquid until what started as separate components becomes something close to gumbo. The Monday red beans tradition is documented to the mid-19th century in New Orleans and was common throughout Gulf Coast African-American households where smoked pork and dried legumes were the most affordable proteins available year-round. The dish does not need watching. It just needs time. Number 18. Porcupine meatballs. This recipe survived the Depression and walked straight into the 1950s without changing a single ingredient. You mixed a pound of ground beef with 1/3 of a cup of raw long-grain rice, an egg, salt, and Worcestershire sauce. You rolled them into balls. The rice was the trick. It cooked inside the meatball, poking out like quills, and it stretched a single pound of beef into twice as many servings. You browned the balls in a skillet, poured in a can of Campbell's tomato soup diluted with water, covered the pan, and simmered for 40 minutes. The whole meal cost about 70 cents. Betty Crocker put it in her picture cookbook in 1950. Better Homes and Gardens printed it through the entire decade. Church cookbooks in Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee carried it well into the 1960s. In rural Appalachia, a mother named Eileen Combs made porcupine meatballs every Monday for 8 years. She stretched 1 pound of ground beef across 7 plates. Her husband worked at the coal mine in Harlan County, Kentucky, and brought home $42 a week. She spent 9 of those dollars on groceries. The meatballs were the anchor of her weekly rotation. The dish embodied a contradiction that defined the era. The post-war prosperity was real. Families were buying houses, cars, television sets, but millions of households, particularly in the rural South and Midwest, were still feeding large families on Depression logic. Porcupine meatballs were a survival strategy dressed in Eisenhower-era clothing. You could serve them to company and nobody would know the recipe was born out of desperation. That was the point. The rice inside the meatball was not a garnish. It was a way to make less look like enough. And for a generation of mothers who remembered what real hunger felt like, making less look like enough was not laziness. It was a skill passed down by women who learned it from their own mothers during the worst years this country has known. Scalloped potatoes with ham required no announcement. Thin sliced raw potatoes, each one translucent enough to see through if held to the light, layered into a buttered baking dish with chopped leftover ham, a scattering of flour, salt, and enough whole milk to come almost to the top. Into a slow oven for an hour and a half until the milk thickened into cream sauce and the top layer of potato went golden and the edges pulled away from the dish. This was the dish that solved Monday. The ham bone from Sunday went into the navy beans, and whatever ham remained went here. Pennsylvania Dutch families had been making versions since the 1800s, brought from Germany and adapted to the root cellars and dairy farms of the Mid-Atlantic, and by the 1940s it was a staple from Ohio to Oregon. You knew it was done when a knife slid through the top with no resistance. You didn't set a timer, you paid attention. Stuffed shells with cottage cheese were the gentle dream of an Italian meal done Southern style. The shells were filled not with expensive ricotta, but with cottage cheese, seasoned with parsley, salt, and a touch of garlic. A jar of tomato sauce made the base, poured thickly over the top and baked until bubbling and fragrant. It was an American twist on an old-world favorite, created by moms who refused to let cost keep them from giving their families something special. The cottage cheese melted softly inside, creamy but light, soaking up the sauce's sweetness. It was filling, tender, and bright on the plate, a little taste of luxury without the price. On weeknights, when money was tight but love was steady, it was enough. It made the table feel like Sunday again. Working mothers built memories one baked dish at a time, turning what they had into what everyone needed. The first forkful was always a quiet one, just to savor the mix of tomato and cheese. Even the smallest kids could sense that this meal meant care. It was proof that joy could be homemade, that pride could be baked into pasta, and that even ordinary kitchens could create a moment of grace. Pork chop rice skillet was the kind of meal that simmered away while seniors rested in their chairs, filling small apartments with the aroma of home cooking. A single bone-in pork chop, often purchased on sale for mere cents per pound, was browned in a well-seasoned skillet until golden. Rice was added directly to the pan along with water or broth, and the whole thing was covered and left to cook slowly until the rice absorbed every drop of porky flavor. The meat became fork tender, practically falling off the bone, while the rice turned creamy and rich from the rendered fat. Some added a can of cream of mushroom soup to make it even more substantial, while others kept it simple with just salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. The dish required almost no attention once assembled, making it perfect for those with limited energy or mobility. One pork chop and a cup of rice fed a senior for an entire day, proving that economy and satisfaction could share the same plate. Number 30. Corn oysters. Sweet corn kernels scraped off the cob, mixed with egg, flour, salt, and pepper, then dropped by the spoonful into a skillet of hot lard. The batter puffed up as it fried, and the edges turned brown and crisp while the center stayed soft and sweet. They were called oysters because the shape and the golden crust resembled a fried oyster. Farm families across the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic made these all through corn season because the ingredient list was whatever you already had. You piled them on a plate and ate them with nothing else, or alongside a slice of ham if the budget allowed. Number 10. Swanson Meatloaf Dinner. Meatloaf was the most American thing you could put in an aluminum tray, and Swanson understood that. Their version was a thick slice of ground beef meatloaf glazed in tomato sauce, sitting next to mashed potatoes and a vegetable, usually peas or corn. The meatloaf was dense and firm, the kind that held its shape when you cut it with the side of a fork. It tasted like every church supper and Wednesday night table your mother ever set, compressed into a form that could survive being frozen, shipped, stored, and reheated without falling apart. That was the engineering problem nobody discussed. A fresh meatloaf crumbles. A frozen meatloaf that has traveled through a supply chain and come out of a 425-degree oven needs to stay in one piece. Swanson managed it with binders and breadcrumbs in ratios no home cook would recognize. The mashed potatoes beside it were instant, made from flakes, and they came out either too dry or too wet depending on how much steam escaped the foil during cooking. The tomato glaze on the meatloaf was sweet, closer to ketchup than marinara, and it formed a caramelized shell on the surface that was honestly the best part of the whole tray. I think the people who loved this dinner loved it because it reminded them of a homemade version they could no longer get. Their mothers had passed, their wives worked nights, or they lived alone and could not see the point of making a full meatloaf for one person. Swanson gave them the shape and the taste without the labor, and that exchange was worth every penny. Number 18. Spam fried rice. You cooked a pot of white rice the day before and left it in the refrigerator overnight so the grains dried out and separated. The next evening, you diced half a can of Spam into small cubes, fried them in a hot wok or skillet until the outsides crisped, pushed them to the side, scrambled an egg in the open space, and then tossed in the cold rice with a few shakes of soy sauce. Stirred it all together over high heat until the rice picked up a faint char on the bottom. If you had a green onion, you sliced it thin on top. This was a meal that came to the mainland with military families who had been stationed in Hawaii and the Pacific. It traveled well because the ingredients traveled well. A bag of rice, a can of Spam, an egg, and a bottle of soy sauce could sit in any kitchen for months. Number 18. Macaroni and tomatoes. You boiled elbow macaroni until it was soft, drained it, and stirred in a can of stewed tomatoes with all the juice, a pat of butter, salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. That was the whole recipe. Some mothers added a handful of diced onion fried in the butter first. Others crumbled a few saltine crackers over the top. The dish came together in the time it took to boil water, and it tasted like something between a soup and a casserole. Warm and simple and slightly sweet from the tomatoes. This was the dinner nobody talked about because it barely qualified as cooking, but it showed up on tables across the Ohio Valley every single week. It was the filler meal, the one between grocery trips, the one that used two things every pantry already held. Number 17. Stuffed green peppers. You cut the tops off, scooped out the seeds, and filled each pepper with a mixture of ground beef, cooked rice, diced onion, and canned tomato sauce. Then you stood them upright in a baking dish, poured more tomato sauce around the base, and baked them for about 45 minutes until the peppers softened and the filling firmed up. The kitchen smelled like a church supper. Every pepper was its own self-contained dinner, neat and round and sitting in a pool of red sauce. Families in Ohio and Pennsylvania made these almost weekly because 1 pound of hamburger stretched across 6 peppers and fed the whole table. You did not need a side dish. The pepper was the bowl and the meal was inside it. Leftovers went into the refrigerator standing up, and the next day you reheated them in the oven, and they tasted even better because the rice had soaked up all the sauce overnight. Number 24. Depression spaghetti. You opened a bottle of ketchup and you opened a box of pasta, and that was the entire grocery list. The home cooks of the 1930s figured out that sugar, vinegar, and tomato puree were the 3 things that made marinara taste like marinara, and ketchup already had all 3. You boiled the noodles, drained them, stirred in half a bottle of ketchup, and you had a plate that looked like Italian food on a budget that did not. A Japanese chef in 1945 watched American GIs eat C-ration spaghetti and invented Neapolitan, still on Tokyo menus today. Down in Haiti, they make breakfast spaghetti with ketchup, sausage, and pepper. One cheap idea, 3 countries, all feeding workers. The bare-bones version fed millions across 2 decades. Number 3. Pot roast stretched across 3 days. A cheap chuck roast, 3 or 4 pounds, seared in a Dutch oven, and then braised low and slow for hours with onions, carrots, potatoes, and a cup of water. Day 1 was the roast dinner itself, carved thick and served with the soft vegetables and the pan juices poured over the top. Day 2, you shredded the leftover meat and piled it on white bread for hot beef sandwiches with gravy ladled over everything. Day 3, the bones and scraps went into a pot with whatever vegetables remained in the crisper, and you simmered it into a beef vegetable soup that tasted richer than anything you could buy in a can. 3 full dinners from 1 piece of meat. That was the math that kept families fed in the 1960s, and the women who did it needed nothing but a Dutch oven, a sharp knife, and the deep understanding that nothing edible gets thrown away. The pot roast was not one dinner. It was a 3-day plan, and the plan was simple. Everybody eats this week. The secret was the raw beef. Recipes that had you brown the ground beef first missed the point. The logic depended on the fat rendering directly into the macaroni and tomato sauce as everything cooked together, binding the pasta in the drippings. Dry, uncooked elbow macaroni first, then raw ground beef crumbled over it, then canned diced tomatoes, then beef broth, just enough to submerge the pasta, then shredded cheddar across the surface. Tight foil, 350, 45 minutes, then uncovered for 10 more to set the cheese. Campbell's published an emergency dinner pamphlet in the 1950s built on this exact principle. Raw starch and raw protein combined with liquid in a sealed dish, which became the organizing idea of American post-war convenience cooking. The broth turns the macaroni translucent where it has not yet absorbed. The beef fat marbles through the pasta, and the cheddar goes slightly crisp at the edges. You pull back the foil and the kitchen smells like a diner in 1957. Number 2. Tuna noodle casserole. The first printed recipe appeared in 1930 in Sunset magazine under the name Noodles and Tuna Fish and Casserole. It came from the Pacific Northwest. The explosion happened in 1952 when Campbell's published a recipe booklet featuring tuna casserole as a showcase for cream of mushroom soup, which had been on shelves since 1934. One baking dish, canned tuna at 25 cents, 1 can of cream of mushroom soup at 10 cents, egg noodles at 20 cents, frozen peas and crushed crackers on top. Mix everything together. 375 degrees for 25 minutes. The whole meal cost about 80 cents for a family of 4. Church potlucks in the 1950s always featured at least 3 versions. It was the dish that every woman in America knew how to make, and nobody was proud of making. The cream of mushroom soup replaced the need for a homemade bechamel entirely. And that single substitution, a 10-cent can where a 20-minute sauce used to be, defined what cooking became in the 1950s. Ham loaf arrived without fanfare and left people looking for more before they understood what they'd eaten. Ground ham combined with raw pork shoulder, packed into a loaf pan, and covered with a glaze of brown sugar and dry mustard that caramelized in the oven into something dark and almost candy-like at the edges. It was built from surplus, the holiday ham ground down, extended with fresh pork for fat and moisture. And it was common enough in Pennsylvania and Midwestern communities through the 1950s and 60s to appear in nearly every church and junior league cookbook of the era. The glaze was the secret. 2 parts brown sugar to 1 part dry mustard, moistened with a little cider vinegar, applied twice during the bake, so the last coat had time to set to a lacquer. If you knew to apply it twice, you'd been taught by someone who knew what they were doing. Most people only applied it once. You could tell by the color. Hot dish with creamed corn was the beating heart of Midwestern comfort. It was ground beef browned in a skillet, mixed with egg noodles, creamed corn, and soup from a can until everything became one perfect bubbling whole. The top browned just enough to crisp, giving way to a creamy, rich center that stuck to your ribs. It was warm, predictable, and perfect. The kind of food that could make you forget about the wind outside or the bills waiting on the counter. Every family had their own version. Some added cheese, others green beans. But they all shared the same truth. It was cheap, filling, and made with love. In that small act of stirring everything together, working moms turned exhaustion into nourishment. It was proof that simplicity could hold as much love as any feast. The edges baked just firm enough to give each serving a crust, a golden seal on a hard day's effort. When it hit the table, plates were filled before the prayer was even finished. It was food that needed no words, only gratitude. Each spoonful carried the rhythm of routine and the comfort of knowing that even in life's hurry, there was still room for care. Neck bones and potatoes was a slow-simmered meal that turned one of the cheapest cuts of pork into something rich, tender, and deeply satisfying. Pork neck bones cost almost nothing because they were mostly bone with small pockets of meat clinging to the crevices. But those bones contained marrow and collagen that, when simmered for hours, created a broth so rich it became gelatinous when cooled. Seniors would brown the neck bones in a deep skillet, add quartered potatoes, onions, and enough water to cover, then let everything simmer until the meat fell from the bones. The potatoes absorbed the porky essence while breaking down slightly to thicken the broth. A pound of neck bones and a few potatoes fed one person for 3 or 4 meals, making it extraordinarily economical. The dish required time but almost no attention, perfect for seniors who could let it cook while resting. Neck bones and potatoes represented true poverty cooking. Humble ingredients transformed through patience into genuine sustenance. Number 20. Fried bologna with mashed potatoes. A thick slice of bologna scored around the edges so it would not curl, fried in a dry skillet until the outside blistered and browned. Serve it on a plate next to a pile of mashed potatoes made from real potatoes, butter, and milk. This was a working-class dinner that showed up in lunchbox towns and factory cities across the Rust Belt and the Ohio Valley. Bologna was one of the cheapest deli meats you could buy, and frying it changed the texture completely. The outside got crispy and a little smoky. The inside stayed soft. Mashed potatoes turned it into a plate that looked and felt complete. No one bragged about serving it. Everyone cleaned their plate. Number 23. Chun King Chow Main Dinner. This was most of America's first introduction to anything remotely Chinese, and it came in a divided aluminum tray with crunchy chow mein noodles on one side and a mix of bean sprouts, celery, and mystery meat in brown sauce on the other. Gino Paolucci built the Chun King brand out of Hibbing, Minnesota, about as far from China as a person could get. The frozen dinner version hit shelves in the late 1950s and stayed through the 1960s. The noodles were the best part. They came out crispy if you followed the oven directions and rubbery if you rushed it. For most families in small-town America, this tray was the entire Chinese food experience until a takeout place opened nearby. The brand changed hands multiple times, and the frozen dinner line quietly vanished. Number 23. Creamed chipped beef on toast. The military called it something unprintable. Families called it Tuesday. You opened a jar of dried beef, tore it into shreds, and stirred it into a thick white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. That was it. You poured the whole thing over toast and ate it with a fork. Soldiers brought this recipe home from the service and kept making it because it was fast and cheap, and it filled you up when nothing else in the pantry would. The beef was salty enough to season the entire sauce on its own. Some cooks added a pinch of black pepper or a shake of paprika, but most did not bother. 2 slices of toast, a ladle of creamed beef, and dinner was done in 10 minutes. It was the kind of meal nobody bragged about and everybody made. Number 14. Steak fingers with cream gravy. Strips of beef round pounded thin, breaded in seasoned flour, and deep fried until they cracked when you bent them. The cream gravy came in a bowl on the side, white and thick with black pepper flecks floating on top. This was Texas truck stop food, born in the same kitchens that invented the chicken fried steak, and it followed the same logic. Take a cheap cut, beat it tender, bread it, fry it, and drown the evidence in gravy. Steak fingers showed up along the I-20 and I-35 corridors in the late 1960s and spread east and north through the 1970s as drivers carried the taste with them. A driver from Dallas would ask for them at a stop in Tennessee, and if the cook had never heard of them, the driver explained how they worked. That is how food traveled before the internet. One plate at a time, one counter at a time, carried by the men who drove the freight. The fingers came with fries and Texas toast, thick sliced white bread buttered and griddled until both sides turned golden. You dipped the fingers in the gravy, ate the fries plain, and wiped the plate with the toast. A full order cost about $1.85 at a Stuckey's outside Abilene in 1975. Steak fingers never made it onto chain restaurant menus. They stayed in the truck stops and the small-town places that understood what a working man needed. Something fried, something with gravy, and something he could eat with his hands if he had to. The gravy recipe was always the same. Frying oil, flour, milk, pepper, nothing else. It looked like wallpaper paste and tasted like the best thing a tired man ever put in his mouth. Number 16. Milk toast. You toasted 2 slices of stale white bread, dropped them in a wide bowl, heated a cup of milk just below a simmer, melted butter and sugar on the toast, then poured the hot milk over with a sprinkle of nutmeg. That was supper on a sick night in 1934. That was breakfast on a cold morning in 1947. Mark Twain ate it. Every grandmother in the Midwest made it for a child with a fever or a husband worn out from the late shift. The bread softened just enough to hold a spoon. The milk turned sweet from the butter melting under it. It cost less than a nickel a bowl. The genius was the staling. Day-old bread held the shape of a slice under hot milk. Fresh bread fell apart inside 90 seconds. Your grandmother set aside the heel of every loaf for milk toast, and that was how a kitchen wasted nothing across a generation. It still tastes like being loved. Number 13. Spam and rice. Hormel introduced spam in 1937, and by the time the war ended, it had found a permanent home in American kitchens that had nothing to do with the military. You sliced it thick, fried it in a skillet until the edges caramelized, and laid it over a mound of white rice with a fried egg on top or a splash of soy sauce. In Hawaii and across the Pacific states, spam and rice became a genuine cultural staple, but it was just as common in trailer parks and small apartments on the mainland where one can and a cup of dry rice fed 2 adults for under half a dollar. The sodium was enormous. Nobody cared. It was hot, filling, and a 12-ounce can sat in your cupboard for years without spoiling. That kind of reliability mattered when the paycheck was not. The smell hit the hallway before you reached the kitchen. Kielbasa and sauerkraut in a hot oven produce a sharp, smoky smell that is not polite and not quiet. Central European immigrant families brought kielbasa into American working-class neighborhoods in the early 20th century. Polish, Slovak, Czech households in mill towns from Pennsylvania to Ohio, and the combination of smoked sausage with fermented cabbage and potato was centuries old before it ever crossed an ocean. The method is simple. Kielbasa coins, drained sauerkraut, chunked potatoes, brown sugar, mustard, oil, all tossed and spread across one pan. 400 degrees, 30 minutes. The brown sugar tames the fermented bite, the potato soaks up sausage fat, and the whole thing goes from pungent and sharp to sweet and tender. Precisely why this dish outlasted the neighborhoods that invented it. The mill towns emptied. The kielbasa stayed. Number 20. Creamed tuna on toast. Every Friday in Catholic America, millions of families needed a cheap dinner with no meat. The Catholic Church's Meatless Friday rule, which stayed in place until 1966, created guaranteed demand for this dish in cities like Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New Orleans. You made a white sauce in one saucepan, butter, flour, milk. You folded in a can of tuna at 25 cents and a handful of frozen peas. You poured it over toast. The whole meal cost about 55 cents. It was the same dish as creamed chipped beef, only with fish instead of dried meat. Children who grew up in Catholic households in the 1950s remember it as the taste of Friday. Some remember it with nostalgia. Some remember it with dread. Most remember both at the same time. The Meatless Friday rule shaped an entire generation of home cooking. When the rule was relaxed in 1966, creamed tuna on toast disappeared from millions of kitchens almost overnight. The dish had no loyalty outside the obligation. Porcupine meatballs earned their name honestly. Raw, long-grain rice pressed into the ground beef before cooking, so as the meatballs simmered, the grains pushed through the surface like quills, swelling as they absorbed the liquid. The idea came from the Depression, when families needed to stretch a pound of ground beef as far as possible. Rice doubled the volume of the meatballs and gave the dish a texture somehow better than plain beef. The rice absorbed the tomato sauce from the inside out, cooking in it rather than alongside it. Most families used a can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup thinned with water, which gave the sauce a sweetness that scratch tomato couldn't replicate. You dropped the raw meatballs into the simmering liquid without browning them first. That was the trick, the part that looked wrong to anyone who hadn't been taught. Browning first would have set the rice before it could expand. The kids who knew that were the ones whose grandmothers had made these during the Depression and never stopped. Beef and barley soup was a working woman's patience in a pot. It started early, with tough cuts of beef browned slow, onions and carrots sizzling until they softened, and barley sprinkled in to thicken everything with heartiness. The smell drifted through the house all afternoon, a sign that something was waiting at the end of the day. It was the kind of meal that didn't need tending, just trust. The kind that simmered quietly while laundry dried and homework got done. By dinner, the broth was deep and rich, the barley plump, the beef tender enough to fall apart with a spoon. It was nutrition dressed as nostalgia, proof that time could turn cheap cuts into something almost luxurious. Moms made it not for praise, but for peace, to warm everyone from the inside out. It was the kind of soup that could cure almost anything a long day brought. The pot itself seemed to hum with warmth, each bubble carrying the smell of comfort. Bread might have been stale, but dipped in that broth, it tasted new again. Every bowl came with seconds, and every refill came with thanks. This was love slow-cooked, ladled gently, and served with pride, the quiet kind that asked for nothing back. A Chili Mac skillet was comfort food that came together in a single pan and satisfied cravings for something hearty and warming. Ground beef was browned with onions, then chili powder, cumin, and a can of tomatoes transformed the mixture into something boldly flavored. Elbow macaroni was added directly to the skillet, along with enough water to cook the pasta, and the whole thing simmered until the noodles were tender and had absorbed the spiced tomato liquid. Shredded cheese melted over the top created strings of gooey richness that made each bite feel indulgent. The dish was adaptable. Kidney beans could be added for extra protein, corn for sweetness, or extra chili powder for those who liked heat. A single skillet of chili mac fed one person for 3 meals, making it both economical and practical for seniors living alone. The combination of protein, carbohydrates, and vegetables in one dish meant balanced nutrition without preparing multiple components. Chili mac was honest, filling, and exactly what a cold evening demanded. Number 15. Scalloped corn. A can of creamed corn mixed with a beaten egg, a handful of crushed crackers, a pat of butter, and a splash of milk, poured into a greased baking dish and baked until the top turned golden and the center set firm. The cracker crumbs gave the surface a crust that crackled under a serving spoon. Farm wives across the Corn Belt and the upper Midwest made it year-round because canned corn was always on the shelf and the rest came from the pantry. Some cooks layered sliced onion through the middle. Others stirred in diced green pepper. It always came out of the oven hot, soft, and filling enough that nobody asked what else was for dinner. Most of these dinners were designed to feed a family, but by the late 1950s, millions of Americans were eating alone. Widows, widowers, people whose children had moved across the country. Cooking for one is a different kind of discipline. You make the same effort for a smaller audience. You set a place at the table even though no one is watching. The women and men who kept cooking real meals for themselves after the house emptied out were doing something harder than following a recipe. They were insisting that they still mattered enough to eat a proper dinner. A pot of soup for one person lasts 3 days. A stuffed pepper is a single serving. The food scales down. The dignity does not. Number 22. Patio Mexican dinner. Before Tex-Mex restaurants spread across the country, patio foods gave the freezer aisle its first taste of enchiladas, tamales, and refried beans. The tray came with a small enchilada rolled tight in a corn tortilla, a tamale still in its husk, Spanish rice, and a compartment of refried beans that looked exactly like brown paste. Patio was based in San Antonio and marketed these dinners as authentic Mexican food for the American table. The enchilada was mild enough that it would not scare anyone in Ohio. The tamale was small but decent. The whole tray gave suburban families permission to feel adventurous on a Wednesday night without leaving the kitchen. Patio eventually got absorbed by larger companies, and the original dinner disappeared from freezers entirely. Number 3. Canned Vienna sausage and cabbage skillet. You quartered a small head of cabbage, sliced it into ribbons, and wilted it down in a skillet with a little butter and salt. While the cabbage softened, you sliced the Vienna sausages into coins and tossed them in on top. Let everything cook together until the cabbage turned translucent and the sausages picked up a faint golden edge. A shake of black pepper and a splash of vinegar at the end cut through the richness and brightened the whole skillet. This was a one-pan dinner that cost next to nothing and filled the kitchen with the smell of warm butter and cooked cabbage. Seniors across the Midwest and the South made this on pension nights when the grocery money had already gone somewhere else. 2 cans of sausages and half a head of cabbage fed one person with enough left in the skillet for a second helping. Nobody planned this meal. It just happened when the shelf had nothing else to give. Number 29. Smothered pork chops. Bone-in chops browned in a cast-iron skillet, then drowned in a pan gravy made from the drippings, a pour of milk, and enough flour to thicken it into something that stuck to the back of a spoon. The gravy went over the chops and over the rice, and most drivers finished every grain. This was southern truck stop country from the Carolinas down to the Gulf, where pork was cheaper than beef and gravy was a food group. The chops were thin because a thick chop took too long when you had 12 drivers lined up at the counter, so they pounded them flat, fried them fast, and buried them in gravy so nobody noticed how thin they were. Number 10. Salmon patties from a can. You opened a 15-ounce can of pink salmon, drained it, mixed in an egg, half a cup of saltine crumbs, a spoon of minced onion, and pepper. You shaped 6 patties, fried them in a 1/4 inch of bacon grease for 3 minutes aside, and you had a Friday supper that fed 5 for less than $1 in 1962. Canned salmon was a backbone of poor American kitchens from 1900 straight through the Carter administration. Catholic families ate it on Fridays. Lutheran families ate it because it was cheaper than chicken. Your grandmother served it with a slice of lemon and a dollop of mayonnaise mixed with sweet pickle relish. She called it a tartar sauce. It worked, and the bones were the secret. The soft little vertebrae in a can of pink salmon are pure calcium, mashed straight into the patty by your grandmother's fork. A single can delivered more calcium than 2 glasses of milk, which is why Depression-era doctors recommended it for nursing mothers. Number 22. American goulash. This had nothing to do with the Hungarian original. American goulash was a pound of ground beef browned in a Dutch oven, tossed with elbow macaroni, a can of stewed tomatoes, and a heavy pour of store-brand tomato sauce. Salt, pepper, maybe a shake of garlic powder if you were feeling bold. The whole pot fed 6 people for about $1.20, and it reheated the next day even better than it tasted fresh. In factory towns across Ohio and Michigan, goulash was Wednesday night. Not because anyone planned it that way. By Wednesday, you were tired, and the box of macaroni was always sitting in the cupboard. Mothers stirred it with one hand while holding a toddler on the opposite hip, and the pot was scraped clean by Thursday lunch. It sounds like a mistake until you eat it. Apricot jam and dry onion soup mix poured over raw chicken pieces and nothing else. No broth, no extra seasoning. The jam melts and spreads thin across the skin, and the dehydrated onion blooms in the moisture the meat releases. By the 40-minute mark, the dish has lacquered itself, the jam reducing to something close to a restaurant glaze, the chicken underneath bronze and pull-apart tender. The sweet and savory logic, fruit with poultry balanced by salt, is as old as medieval European cooking. But nobody at the counter with a jar of Smuckers and a packet of Lipton was thinking about that. They were thinking about dinner, and what they landed on tasted like more effort than it was. The dish arrived in American kitchens through the 1970s and 80s, when shelf-stable condiments made complicated-tasting meals possible without anything being fresh. Open 2 things, pour them over chicken, and sit down to something that looked like you meant it. Number 4. Sunday pot roast. The braising technique came to New England through French immigrants and to the Midwest through German settlers. Food writer James Beard traced the Yankee pot roast directly to French cooking adapted to tougher American beef cuts. By the 1950s, the Sunday pot roast was a cultural ritual. The family went to church. The roast went into the Dutch oven. 3 to 4 pounds of chuck at 55 cents a pound. Carrots, potatoes, onions, celery, beef broth, salt, pepper, and thyme. You covered it tightly and braised it at 325 degrees for 3 to 4 hours. The full meal for 6 people cost about $2.25. It was the most expensive meal on this list. And it was the one every generation knows by smell. The aroma of chuck roast braising on a Sunday morning while the family was at church and then came home to find dinner waiting. That smell was the architecture of the American weekend. Sunday spaghetti in American kitchens had almost nothing to do with Italy and everything to do with what happened to Italian cooking when it crossed the ocean and hit a country where beef was cheap and tomatoes came in cans. Italian immigrants had made their Sunday gravy with pork bones and sausage, a long simmered sauce that took most of the day. By the 1950s, when the sauce had spread to non-Italian households through neighborhoods and church friends and the back of the Hunt's tomato can, the pork bones had been replaced with ground beef browned in a skillet and stirred directly in. It still simmered for hours. That part wasn't negotiable. You started it after lunch on Sunday and let it go until supper, the whole house filling with the smell of tomatoes cooking down into something deep and almost sweet. Served over spaghetti with a piece of white bread to push things around the plate, it fed 6 people on 2 pounds of meat and a few cans of tomatoes. The sauce always tasted better the next day. Everyone knew that. Nobody waited. Chicken fricassee was elegance on a dime, a creamy stovetop stew that made the kitchen smell like Sunday even on a Tuesday. Bone-in chicken simmered slow in a white sauce made from broth, flour, and a touch of milk until it turned velvety smooth. Carrots and peas joined in, bright against the pale gravy, filling the pot with color and comfort. The sauce thickened as it cooked, clinging to every piece of chicken until it looked like something straight out of a cookbook. But this was not luxury. This was love disguised as dinner. Moms learned to stretch every bit of flavor, using what they had to make something that tasted rich. The steam fogged the windows, the wooden spoon moved slow, and the smell said everything that words could not. It was the kind of meal that made you stop and breathe before taking that first bite. Bologna and potato fry-up was the dinner of last resort that no one complained about. Sliced bologna browned in a skillet until the edges curled, joined by cubed potatoes that fried crisp in the same pan. The onions went in next, sizzling in the leftover grease, filling the kitchen with that unmistakable scent of survival and satisfaction. Salt, pepper, and maybe a little mustard were all it needed to come alive. It was cheap, quick, and filling. The kind of meal that got families through those long stretches between paydays. Kids loved the salty flavor. Parents loved that it cost almost nothing and still felt like home. The sound of the spatula scraping the skillet became a kind of evening music, steady and sure. It was not a recipe so much as a rhythm, one born of practicality and pride. Chicken fricassee was old-fashioned comfort that transformed tough, inexpensive chicken parts into tender, gravy-smothered perfection. Before boneless breasts dominated supermarket cases, seniors bought leg quarters for pennies and knew how to coax flavor from every piece. The chicken was dredged in seasoned flour and browned slowly in a deep skillet, building a fond on the bottom that would become rich gravy. Onions and celery joined the pan before liquid was added, and the whole pot simmered until the meat fell from the bones. The gravy thickened naturally from the flour coating, creating a velvety sauce that begged to be soaked up with bread or rice. One chicken leg quarter could feed a senior for 2 meals, when stretched with plenty of gravy over something starchy. The dish was forgiving, patient, and deeply satisfying. The kind of cooking that required time but rewarded it generously with flavor and nourishment that modern convenience foods simply cannot match. Number 23. Biscuits and sausage gravy. Homemade biscuits split open on a plate, covered in a thick white gravy made from breakfast sausage, pan drippings, flour, and milk. The gravy was peppery and rich, and the biscuits soaked it up like a sponge. In the rural South, this was dinner as often as it was breakfast. A tube of bulk sausage, a few cups of flour, and some milk gave you enough food to fill a full table for very little money. You browned the sausage, left the grease in the pan, whisked in the flour until it turned golden, then added the milk slowly until it thickened. Every family had their own ratio. None of them wrote it down. Number 9. Morton chicken dinner. Morton's take on chicken was a small piece of fried chicken, usually a drumstick or a thigh, with mashed potatoes and a vegetable. The chicken came out of the oven with a coating that was more soft than crispy, a problem that haunted every frozen fried chicken dinner of the era. The breading absorbed moisture during freezing and reheating, and no amount of oven time could fully restore the crunch. Morton compensated by making the seasoning heavier. Their chicken tasted saltier and more peppery than Swanson's, which some people preferred. At its price point, Morton's chicken dinner delivered exactly what it promised, and not a crumb more. It was chicken. It was dinner. It was on a tray. Those three facts were the entire pitch, and for years, they were enough. There is something nobody mentions about TV dinners, and it might be the most important thing about them. They were designed for one person. The portions were single-serve, the trays were individual. The advertising showed one person sitting in front of a television with a folding tray table. By the mid-1960s, millions of Americans were eating dinner alone for the first time in their lives. Widows, widowers, divorced men who had never turned on a stove, young women in apartments far from home. The TV dinner did not judge any of them. It did not require skill or company or conversation. It asked for nothing and filled a stomach and let you eat in silence without that silence feeling like defeat. The food was always secondary. The permission was always the product. Number 6. Deviled ham stuffed peppers. You cut the tops off green bell peppers, scooped out the seeds, and blanched them in boiling water for 3 minutes to soften the walls. Mixed the deviled ham with cooked rice, a spoonful of tomato sauce, and a little onion powder. Packed the mixture tight into each pepper, stood them upright in a baking dish, poured a thin layer of tomato sauce around the base, and baked until the peppers wrinkled and the filling firmed up. The deviled ham seasoned the rice from the inside, so you did not need to add much else. 2 peppers made a meal. 3 made a feast. The presentation looked like something from a proper recipe book, and nobody had to know the whole thing came together from 2 cans and a bag of minute rice. Number 10. Shepherd's pie. Ground beef browned with onion and mixed with canned peas, carrots, and a pour of leftover gravy. You spread it into a baking dish and covered the whole surface with mashed potatoes, then dragged a fork across the top so the peaks would brown in the oven. 30 minutes later, the potato crust had gone golden at the tips, and the meat filling was bubbling up through the cracks at the edges. You served it with a big spoon straight from the dish. 1 scoop held everything a meal needed. Meat on the bottom, vegetables in the middle, starch on top. Mothers who made Sunday roast on the weekend turned Monday's leftovers into this without a recipe or a second thought. The dish stretched 1 pound of hamburger into a full family dinner that looked like it took an hour but needed 20 minutes of actual work. There is a moment after the children leave and the house goes quiet when you have to decide whether you are still going to set the table, whether you are going to cook a real dinner or just open a can of soup and eat it standing at the counter. That decision sounds small. It is not. It is about whether you still believe you are worth the effort of a hot meal on a real plate. The women who made the dinners on this list did not cook because it was fun or because anyone thanked them for it. They cooked because dinner was the 1 hour of the day when the family sat in the same room and ate the same food and talked about the same things. When the family left, the question changed. It was no longer what are we having tonight, it was whether to bother at all. The answer, for the ones who kept cooking, was always yes. Number 26. Beef tips over egg noodles. Chunks of beef round seared hard and braised in beef broth with sliced onions until the meat went tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. The gravy turned brown and rich from the drippings, and it got ladled over a pile of wide egg noodles on a heavy ceramic plate. Some stops added mushrooms from a can. Most did not bother. This was a steam table regular from Pennsylvania, clear across to Missouri, and it held under a heat lamp for hours without losing a thing. The noodles caught the gravy in their folds, and every forkful came up loaded. A full plate and change left over from a $5 bill. The menu at a truck stop was not a list. It was a map. Drive the I-10 corridor from Jacksonville to El Paso, and the food changed mile by mile. Fried catfish gave way to chicken fried steak around the Louisiana-Texas line. Pork chops disappeared north of Kentucky and came back near St. Louis. The stops that lasted cooked what the land around them produced: catfish ponds in the Delta, beef feedlots on the plains, dairy farms in Wisconsin that kept the cream gravy thick. A driver who ran the same route long enough knew where he was by what came out of the kitchen. Grits meant south. Bean soup meant Midwest. The food told you where you were before the highway signs did. Number 21. Hamburger gravy on toast. You browned half a pound of ground beef in cast iron, sprinkled 3 tablespoons of flour into the grease, stirred a minute, then poured in 2 cups of milk and thickened it. You poured the gray, peppery gravy over toast. 30 cents fed 4 in 1962. The Navy called it SOS for short, which stood for 2 words your grandmother would not say out loud. The dish first appeared in the 1910 Manual for Army Cooks and fed soldiers from World War I through Vietnam. The trick is, the flour cooks in the beef fat for a full minute before the milk goes in. That kills the raw taste. Your father did it without thinking. What most people miss is that the bread mattered as much as the gravy. White toast was wrong. You wanted Wonder Bread 3 days stale because the dry crumbs soaked the gravy without going to mush. Number 14. Chicken and dumplings. This was the meal that turned one chicken into a feast, and the women who made it could stretch a single bird across 2 full days without anyone feeling shortchanged. You started with a whole fryer, the cheapest one in the store, and simmered it in a big pot of salted water with celery, onion, and a few peppercorns until the meat was tender enough to fall away from the bone. Then you pulled the bird out, stripped every last bit of meat off the carcass with your fingers, and dropped the bones back in the broth for another 20 minutes of flavor. The dumplings were simple. Flour, baking powder, a little salt, and enough buttermilk to make a thick, sticky batter. You dropped spoonfuls of it straight into the simmering broth, clamped the lid on tight, and did not touch it for 15 minutes. When you lifted the lid, the dumplings had puffed up into soft white pillows floating in a broth that had gone thick and cloudy from the starch. You stirred the shredded chicken back in and ladled it into deep bowls. In the mountains of western North Carolina, churchwomen made chicken and dumplings for every funeral, every homecoming, and every evening when someone in the community simply needed feeding. 1 chicken, a cup of flour, and an hour of patience fed 10 people. The leftovers went into mason jars that showed up on a neighbor's porch the next morning without a note attached. It was never really about the chicken. It was about turning almost nothing into something warm enough to carry across the road to someone who needed it. Chicken divan began as the signature dish of the Divan Parisienne restaurant in New York City's Chatham Hotel, created by a chef named Anthony Lagasse in the early 20th century. Layered chicken and broccoli in a rich cream sauce served as the restaurant's centerpiece. By the late 1950s, home cooks had rebuilt it from what was on hand: frozen broccoli, leftover chicken, cream of chicken soup, mayonnaise, lemon juice, a teaspoon of curry powder, and cheddar across the top. The restaurant version called for a scratch bechamel. The home version needed a can opener and 30 minutes, and it tasted as though someone had genuinely tried. Frozen broccoli in one layer, cooked chicken over that, the soup and mayonnaise mixture poured over everything, cheddar on top, 350 until golden and bubbling. The curry powder is the thing most people skip, which is why their version never quite lands. She did not skip it. She knew what a single teaspoon did to a cream sauce, added it without measuring, and you never knew it was there until she was not making it anymore. Number 17. Macaroni and cheese from scratch. Kraft had introduced its boxed version in 1937 during the Depression and sold 8 million boxes in the first year at 19 cents each. By the 1950s, both versions existed side by side in the same kitchens. The scratch version was the one you made for company. Elbow macaroni, a white sauce of butter, flour, and milk, and 2 cups of real cheddar or Velveeta, which melted smoothly and did not break. You cooked it all in one pot. The whole dish cost about 55 cents from scratch, compared to 19 cents for the box. That gap told you everything about the decade. The housewife who served scratch macaroni and cheese to guests and Kraft on Tuesdays was performing a quiet negotiation about what kind of cook she was and what kind of evening this was going to be. Stuffed bell peppers looked like they required planning. Company food dressed up as everyday food. Peppers hollowed out with a spoon, filled with ground beef, rice, and canned tomatoes. then set in a baking dish and slid into a moderate oven until the tops browned and the peppers softened. The dish made sense in the post-war years because it used everything efficiently. Beef stretched further with rice, the pepper was the container, the tomato sauce baked in. Families who moved to the suburbs in the 1950s found it on the back of the Hunt's tomato sauce can, in church recipe swaps, in the Better Homes and Gardens cookbook. What varied from kitchen to kitchen was the seasoning: Worcestershire in one house, garlic powder and dried oregano in another, plain salt and pepper in the next. You knew a good one by the smell through the oven door, beef and tomato going caramel at the edges, the pepper releasing its sweetness into the sauce below. The smell told you. You didn't need the clock. Smothered cube steak was the working person's answer to fancy beef dishes, turning a cheap, tough cut into something fork-tender and swimming in rich brown gravy. Cube steak cost a fraction of better cuts because the butcher had already tenderized it by running it through a machine that broke down the tough fibers. Seniors would season the steak, dredge it in flour, and brown it quickly in a hot skillet before adding sliced onions and enough water to create a braising liquid. Covered and cooked low and slow, the meat became impossibly tender, while the flour coating dissolved into the liquid, creating gravy without extra effort. The onions melted into sweet strands that draped over the meat like silk. A single cube steak served over rice or mashed potatoes fed one person generously, with the gravy stretching the meal further. The dish required patience but rewarded it with flavors that belied its humble origins. Smothered cube steak proved that cheap cuts simply needed time and technique to become something satisfying. Number 10. Kidney stew. Beef kidneys trimmed, soaked in salted water to pull out the strong flavor, then cut into pieces and browned in a skillet with onion and a dusting of flour. You added water and let it simmer until the kidneys turned tender and the liquid thickened into a dark, rich gravy. Some cooks added carrots and potatoes to stretch it further. And kidneys were one of the cheapest cuts at the butcher counter because most shoppers walked right past them. Served over rice or with thick bread to soak up the gravy, kidney stew filled a table for a fraction of what a roast cost. By the 1960s, organ meats fell out of fashion, and this dish went with them. Number 17. Swanson macaroni and cheese dinner. This was the one kids asked for by name. A tray with a compartment of elbow macaroni in orange cheese sauce, usually next to a vegetable nobody touched, and sometimes a small brownie or fruit cobbler in the dessert slot. The cheese sauce came out of the oven, bubbling around the edges and lukewarm in the center, no matter how long you cooked it. Swanson's version was thicker and creamier than Morton's, and kids knew the difference. It was not Kraft, and it was not homemade, and it lived somewhere in between where most frozen food made its home. Swanson eventually dropped this dinner as the brand shifted toward adult-oriented meals. The kids who loved it grew up and forgot it existed until right now. Number 13. Canned beef chow mein. La Choy sold it in a tall can with a separate, smaller can of crispy noodles banded to the side. You heated the chow mein in a skillet, poured it over the crunchy noodles on a plate, and ate it with a fork. The vegetables were soft and the beef was cut thin, almost shaved, floating in a sauce that tasted like soy and celery and something faintly sweet. It was not Chinese food. Nobody pretended it was. But it was hot and it was different from everything else on the shelf. And on a night when you could not face another plate of the same 3 things you had been eating all week, that difference was worth the price of the can. Seniors bought it because it required no additions, no sides, and no decisions. Open, heat, eat. The crunchy noodles on top made it feel like a real meal instead of something poured from a can, even though that is exactly what it was. Number 24. Liver and onions. You either loved this meal or you sat at the table until bedtime staring at it. Calf's liver sliced thin, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried in bacon drippings until the outside turned crisp and the inside stayed pink. The onions went in first, cooked low and slow until they turned golden and sweet, then piled on top of the liver like a blanket. Mothers served this once a week because liver was cheap and the doctor said it was good for your blood. Children pushed it around the plate. Fathers ate it without complaint. And grandmothers made it better than anyone because they knew the secret was not overcooking it. The moment liver went gray and tough, the meal was ruined. A good cook pulled it from the skillet while it still had give. Served with mashed potatoes and a glass of milk, this was a dinner that tasted like iron and obligation, and something close to love. Number 28, chicken and flat noodles. Not the kind from a box. These were thick, hand-cut egg noodles dropped into a pot of chicken broth that had been simmering with a whole bird since morning. The noodles soaked up the broth and turned soft and heavy, almost like dumplings but flatter. A truck stop cook in Indiana or Central Illinois started the pot before sunrise and served it straight through the dinner rush. You got a bowl heaped with shredded chicken and those fat noodles sitting in a shallow pool of broth with a sleeve of saltine crackers on the table. Comfort in a bowl for about $1.50. Number 17, pasta and peas. You diced a potato, diced half an onion, fried them in olive oil until soft, dumped in a can of peas with its liquid, added water to cook a half-pound of rigatoni. A woman named Clara Canucciari grew up eating it in upstate New York during the Depression and made it famous on YouTube at age 91 before she passed at 98. She said pasta was the crutch her family leaned on when there was no meat for the table, no money for the rent, and no light at the end of the calendar. The potato thickens the broth, the pea liquid salts the sauce, the pasta holds on to everything. 40 cents in 1934. $2 and change today. Cheaper than fast food? Better than fast food. Clara cooked the pasta directly in the pea water because the starch and the canning salt built a glossy sauce without butter. She made it the way her grandmother had on a wood stove. Number 4. Pinto beans and cornbread. A pound of dried pintos soaked overnight and simmered all day long with a ham hock, a halved onion, and enough salt to draw it all together. The cornbread was baked in a cast-iron skillet greased with bacon drippings, and the bottom crust came out dark and crunchy and faintly smoky. You crumbled the cornbread into a deep bowl, ladled the beans over the top, and ate it with a raw sliced onion on the side if you grew up in the right part of the country. Across the South and the Ozarks, pinto beans and cornbread was Monday dinner every single Monday because the beans needed a full day to simmer, and Monday was wash day, the day you stayed near the house anyway. The whole meal cost pennies. The ritual of making it cost nothing at all. She saved the cream of celery for pork. That was the division she had settled on. Cream of mushroom went with chicken. Cream of celery went with pork. And if you used the wrong one, she would notice and say nothing, and you would know. Thick-cut pork chops into the dish without browning, only a light salt, the undiluted cream of celery spread over each chop like a blanket. Dried onion flakes, paprika, foil tight. Baked at 325 for 90 minutes, low enough that the connective tissue dissolved and the collagen seeped into the soup until it thickened toward gravy. The pork chops sold today are leaner and dry out at that temperature, which is part of why nobody makes this the way she made it. The other part is simpler. She is gone. The unwritten rule about which soup went with which meat went with her, and nobody thought to ask until it was already too late. Number 15, chicken fricassee. The dish had been in American cookbooks since the 18th century. Mary Randolph published a version in The Virginia Housewife in 1824. By the 1950s, convenience food had changed it completely. Poppy Cannon's Can Opener Cookbook in 1953 reduced the recipe to a single instruction: open a can. The home version was not much harder. You browned chicken pieces in a Dutch oven, added a can of cream of chicken soup, sliced mushrooms, onion, celery, and a splash of white wine. You covered it and simmered for 45 minutes. The whole meal cost about $1.20. Chicken fricassee had a French name. In the 1950s, that alone elevated a Tuesday dinner into something that felt like you were trying. Most women in America were making it from a can of soup. Nobody talked about that part. The name did the work. It made a 10-cent can of soup taste like ambition. Creamed peas and new potatoes arrived at the table for about 3 weeks out of the year, and those 3 weeks were the point. Early summer, when the peas were still sweet and barely past the size of a child's thumbnail, and the new potatoes could be skinned by rubbing them under cold water with your thumb. Those two things went into a thin cream sauce made from butter, flour, and whole milk, and served while the peas were still bright. The dish existed only during the narrow window when both overlapped in the garden, which made it unrepeatable and anticipated. Frozen peas ended the urgency in the 1960s. Once you could make it anytime, people mostly stopped making it at all. She always made it the first Tuesday after she pulled the first potatoes. You could set a calendar by it. Turkey pot pie with biscuit topping was the warmest kind of thrift. Leftover turkey, peas, and carrots swam in creamy gravy beneath a golden crust of drop biscuits. It came from the hands of mothers who knew how to make one meal become two, maybe three. The oven turned the house into a bakery, filling it with the scent of butter and broth. When the spoon broke through the crust, steam rose up like memory. Each bite was soft, savory, and full of gratitude. It was food made for togetherness, for laughter between bites, for quiet seconds before bedtime. The flaky biscuits soaked up the gravy like sponges, making every taste better than the last. It was proof that the best meals were born not from plenty, but from purpose. The clatter of plates, the scrape of spoons, the sighs after second helpings, all of it felt like love taking form. Every bite carried effort, every crumb a piece of care. In the quiet after dinner, moms wiped the counter, knowing they had done enough. It was comfort sealed in crust, a reminder that joy could be baked from what was left behind. Spanish rice with ground beef was a one-skillet wonder that brought bold, tomatoey flavor to tables across America during the mid-20th century. A quarter pound of ground beef was browned with diced onion and green pepper until fragrant, then rice was added directly to the skillet and toasted until it turned slightly golden. Canned tomatoes, water, and a generous shake of chili powder transformed the mixture into something vibrant and satisfying. The rice absorbed the spiced tomato liquid as it cooked, each grain taking on a reddish hue and robust flavor. Some added a splash of Worcestershire sauce or a pinch of cumin for extra depth. The dish came together in under 30 minutes and required only a single pan, making cleanup simple for those living alone. One skillet of Spanish rice fed a senior for 2 or 3 meals, providing protein, carbohydrates, and vegetables in every serving. The bold flavors made it feel special despite costing mere pennies to prepare, proving that budget cooking could still deliver excitement. Number 29. Sloppy Joes. Ground beef browned with onion, then stirred together with ketchup, a little mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and brown sugar until the mixture turned thick and sweet and tangy. You spooned it onto a soft hamburger bun and ate it with both hands. The name was honest. There was no clean way to eat one. Children loved them because they were messy and sweet. Parents loved them because a pound of beef and a bottle of ketchup produced enough filling for the whole family. School cafeterias served them by the hundreds. Church fellowship halls put them out on steam tables. In the 1950s, sloppy joes were everywhere, and the only rule was that the bun had to be soft enough to absorb the sauce without falling apart. Number 13. Morton Beef Dinner. Morton was always the least expensive option in the freezer case, and the beef dinner showed exactly where they cut costs. A thin slice of beef in brown gravy, a serving of mashed potatoes from flakes, and a vegetable that was either corn or mixed vegetables depending on the production run. The gravy was the dominant flavor. It covered everything and tasted the same whether it sat on beef, turkey, or chicken. Morton sold millions of these trays to families who could not justify the extra cost for Swanson. The portion was smaller, the quality was exactly what the price promised, and Morton never pretended otherwise. Their entire business was built on being the cheapest option, and that honesty kept them in freezers for years. Canned chicken and dumplings. This was the meal that made a cold apartment feel like a house. You opened a large can of chunk chicken, drained most of the liquid into a pot, added water or a splash of milk, and brought it to a low simmer. Then you dropped in small spoonfuls of biscuit dough, the kind you made with nothing but flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and enough shortening to hold it together. Covered the pot and let the dumplings steam for about 15 minutes without lifting the lid. That part was important. If you peeked, the dumplings went flat. The chicken fell apart into soft shreds in the broth. The dumplings puffed up thick and pillowy, soaking up the liquid from underneath while staying dry on top. Some people added a spoonful of dried parsley or a shake of black pepper, but nothing else was required. This was comfort in its most basic mechanical form. Hot starch, warm protein, and a bowl that kept your hands from shaking on a cold night. Women in Appalachia and across the rural South made versions of this going back generations, long before the chicken came in a can. The canned version was faster, but the principle was the same. You stretched a small amount of meat into a full meal by surrounding it with dough and broth. The dumplings did the heavy lifting. The chicken was almost a garnish. Grandmothers made this when their grandchildren came to visit, and there was nothing else in the pantry worth offering. The kids never knew the meal was born out of necessity. They just remembered the dumplings. They remembered the steam rising when the lid came off and the way the whole kitchen smelled like flour and warm broth for the rest of the evening. Number 11. Hot dish, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas. Everybody in those states knew exactly what this was. Ground beef browned in a skillet, mixed with a can of cream of mushroom soup and a can of green beans, poured into a casserole dish and topped with a layer of frozen tater tots. You baked it until the tots turned crispy and the filling bubbled underneath. Not casserole, not a bake. Hot dish. The name was regional and the loyalty was fierce. Church basements across the upper Midwest served some version of it at every potluck, every funeral, every Wednesday night supper. Some families used corn instead of green beans. Others added cheese on top. But the tater tots were the constant. You did not mess with the tater tots. That was the rule. Number 10, roast beef dinner. A thick slice of slow roasted beef, brown on the outside and pink in the center, served with mashed potatoes, brown gravy, and whatever vegetable the cook had going that day. Green beans, buttered corn, or stewed tomatoes. The roast beef dinner was the most expensive plate at most truck stops, and it was the meal a driver ordered when he wanted to feel like he was sitting down to a real Sunday dinner. The beef was a whole bottom round or a chuck roast that went into the oven before dawn and came out in the early afternoon. The cook sliced it on a cutting board behind the counter, and you could watch the steam rise off the meat while he plated it. The gravy came from the drippings in the pan and tasted like concentrated beef with a backbone of onion and black pepper. At a truck stop on the I-70 corridor through Indiana and Illinois, a roast beef dinner went for $2.50 in 1975 with a dinner roll and a refill on coffee. That same meal at a sit-down restaurant in town ran $4 or more. Drivers knew the math. They drove past the restaurant and pulled into the truck stop lot because the food was the same and the price was half. A driver who ordered the roast beef dinner had already decided he was sitting for 20 minutes. He had already done the math in his logbook and knew he had the time. The roast beef was the reward, the meal that meant the week was going well. And when a driver ordered it 2 nights in a row, the waitress knew not to ask. She just sliced a little thicker and brought the good rolls. Number 12. Hoe cakes with sorghum. You whisked a cup of cornmeal, half a cup of buttermilk, a beaten egg, salt, and a tablespoon of bacon grease, and spooned it into hot cast iron in palm-sized rounds. The name comes from the iron blade of a garden hoe, which freed slaves and sharecroppers used as a griddle over an open fire when there was no proper pan in the cabin. The Cherokee taught it to the colonists. Black families in South Carolina made hoe cakes a quiet act of survival through the Jim Crow century. You eat them with sorghum poured straight on top. They cost pennies. They are, by every honest measure, ancestral food. The genius was the bacon grease in the batter itself. A tablespoon of rendered fat made the hoe cakes brown the way a real pancake brown does, and the salt from the cured pork seasoned the corn from the inside. Without the grease, the cakes were chalky. With it, they tasted like the breakfast stove. Number 18. Liver and onions. Beef liver sliced thin, dredged in seasoned flour, and pan-fried in bacon grease until the outside turned crisp and the inside stayed just barely pink. The onions went into the same pan, sliced into rings and cooked slow until they turned sweet and translucent. Served with mashed potatoes and a cold glass of whole milk, this showed up on tables across the country at least once a week during the 1960s. Mothers told their children it was good for the blood, which happened to be true. Most children hated it. Most adults pretended not to notice. But the combination of crispy liver and soft sweet onions was genuinely delicious if you gave it half a chance, and a whole generation grew up strong on a dinner they complained about every single time it appeared. Uncooked long-grain rice goes in first, dry, straight from the bag, no pre-rinsing. That was the rule. And if you had to ask why, you were not there yet. Bone-in pork chops lay on top, seasoned with salt, onion powder, and paprika, and a can of cream of mushroom soup thinned with 1 can of water went over all of it. Foil tight, 350, 1 hour covered and 15 uncovered to brown the top. The rice absorbed every drop of pork fat and broth, pulling flavor up through the grain the way only sealed, slow heat allows, and the chops came out falling toward the bone. Nobody called this a recipe. It was just the Tuesday answer when the budget was low. Through the 1950s and 60s, home economists promoted pork and rice casseroles as the most cost-efficient complete protein a household could produce. Meat, starch, and fat in one sealed dish, no moisture wasted. Today, the chops come out of an air fryer and the rice is instant, and the patience of that sealed hour is gone. She never diluted the soup. That was the thing most people got wrong when they tried to copy it. They thinned the can, and the noodles came out swimming instead of coated. The real method: bone-in chicken thighs straight into the casserole dish, dry egg noodles scattered around them without pre-cooking, and the cream of mushroom soup poured undiluted, the whole thick can, over the top, then cover tight. By the time the oven finished, the noodles had pulled up every bit of that condensed soup and the chicken skins rendered fat. Campbell's began publishing casserole recipes from their condensed soups in 1941, and this dump-and-bake logic became the foundation of how a generation of women fed families without measuring and without writing anything down for whoever came after. You can follow the method exactly. Whatever she added, the decision to leave the skin on, the extra crack of pepper before the foil went down, went with her, and no amount of trying will bring it fully back. Number 22. American Chop Suey. In Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, this was what your mother made when she had nothing planned: ground beef, elbow macaroni, and canned tomatoes in one skillet. It had no connection to actual Chinese chop suey. The name was borrowed to make plain meat and pasta sound like something. The real Chinese-American chop suey dated back to the 1890s in San Francisco. The New England version was a completely different dish that showed up in every school cafeteria and every community fundraiser cookbook from Boston to Hartford. 1 pound of ground beef at 45 cents, a box of elbows at 15 cents, 2 cans of tomatoes at 10 cents each. You browned the beef, added everything else, covered the skillet, and walked away for 15 minutes. Under 90 cents for the whole meal. Every family in New England had a version, and every family thought theirs was the original. It was the dish that proved you did not need a name for something for it to be the best meal of the week. Tamale pie was not tamales, and it made no apology for that. A spiced ground beef filling, onion, garlic, canned tomatoes, chili powder, a little cumin, spread into a baking dish and covered with a cornmeal crust that baked into something between thick polenta and a cornbread lid. The concept arrived in California in the early 1900s through Sunset magazine recipes that tried to simplify traditional tamale preparation for home cooks who didn't have the equipment or the extended family to make real tamales in quantity. By the 1940s, it had spread east through home economics classes and school cafeteria programs, landing in Midwestern and Southern kitchens far from any Mexican cooking tradition. Kids who grew up eating it in school cafeterias rarely knew its California origins. They just knew it was the day the line moved fast and people came back for seconds. It vanished from most tables by the 1980s when Tex-Mex restaurants started appearing in the suburbs. Beef and tater tot bake was what happened when practicality met pride. It started with ground beef browned in a skillet mixed with canned vegetables, cream soup, and a pinch of seasoning that every mother knew by heart. Then came the tater tots, lined neatly across the top like soldiers waiting for duty. ready to turn crisp and golden in the oven. The smell that followed was the smell of relief, warm, savory, and steady. The bubbling soup beneath made a soft stew while the tots stayed crunchy, giving each bite a bit of both comfort and contrast. It was a weeknight win that felt like victory, a way to make something hearty without much time or money. When the casserole dish hit the table, conversation started again. The sound of forks clinking was a soundtrack to everyday life, simple, predictable, and full. It proved that love did not need fancy ingredients. It just needed to show up hot. Corned beef hash from a can became an unlikely hero for seniors who needed hot, filling meals without the fuss of extensive preparation. The rectangular cans lined grocery store shelves at budget-friendly prices, containing a mixture of corned beef and potatoes that transformed when properly cooked. The secret was patience, spreading the hash in a hot, greased skillet and leaving it alone until a dark, crispy crust formed on the bottom. That crust was the prize, shattering against the teeth before giving way to the soft, savory interior. A fried egg placed on top turned it into a complete meal, the runny yolk creating an instant sauce that coated every bite. Seniors living alone appreciated that a single can provided 2 generous servings, each one satisfying enough to carry them through to the next meal. The dish required only a skillet and a few minutes of attention, making it perfect for those days when cooking felt like too much effort. Corned beef hash proved that convenience and comfort could coexist beautifully. Number 27. Tomato soup and grilled cheese. A can of Campbell's tomato soup mixed with milk heated on the stove. 2 slices of white bread with American cheese pressed flat in a buttered skillet until the bread turned brown and the cheese pulled in strings. This was not a side dish. For millions of families in the 1950s, this was Tuesday night supper. The soup ran hot and tangy, and the sandwich carried enough richness to make the whole meal feel complete. Diners served the same pairing for more money, but most people made it at home because there was nothing to get wrong. You needed a can, a loaf, and a few slices of cheese, and everybody at the table ate. Number 12. Morton macaroni and cheese dinner. If Swanson's version was the name brand, Morton's was the store brand dressed in a different box. Thinner sauce, smaller elbows, and a cheese flavor that leaned more toward powder than dairy. The side was always a vegetable, and the tray was noticeably smaller. Kids who grew up eating Morton's did not know the difference until they tried Swanson's at a friend's house and realized cheese sauce could be thicker. Morton charged less, and in a household with 4 kids and 1 paycheck, that math mattered more than texture. The dinner vanished from shelves in the early 1970s as Morton trimmed their frozen line to focus on pot pies and fried chicken. Nobody wrote a letter about it. The shelf space just filled with something else. Number 21. Vienna sausages and pork and beans. You opened both cans, sliced the little sausages in half lengthwise, and heated everything together in the same saucepan. That was the recipe, the whole recipe. The Vienna sausages added a salty, soft protein to the sweet and smoky beans, and together they made a meal that sat heavy enough in your stomach to get you through the night. Eaten with a piece of cornbread or a few saltine crackers, this was supper for one on a pension check night when you did not feel like standing in front of the stove any longer than you had to. The saucepan went from shelf to burner to bowl in about 4 minutes. You could eat and be washing the dish before the evening news started. Quick, quiet, and done. There was a time when the canned meat aisle was the most important row in the grocery store, not the produce section, not the bakery. The aisle with the short, heavy cans lined up like ammunition. For seniors living on a fixed income, that aisle was the difference between eating and not eating. A can of Spam could sit on the shelf for years. It did not spoil. It did not need refrigeration. It did not go bad if the power went out. And when the Social Security check came a day late or the heating bill ate into the grocery money, those cans were still right there on the shelf waiting. Nobody wrote a cookbook about canned meat dinners. Nobody had to. The recipes lived in muscle memory, passed from kitchen to kitchen, hand to hand. Number 8. Salmon loaf. 1 can of pink salmon, a handful of cracker crumbs, a beaten egg, a little minced onion, and a splash of milk. You mixed it all together, packed it into a loaf pan, and baked it until the top turned golden and the edges pulled away from the sides. It came out firm enough to slice like a meatloaf, and you served it with creamed peas or a white sauce poured over the top. The dish sat somewhere between a meatloaf and a croquette, and it stretched one can of fish into a full family dinner. Coastal families might have laughed at the idea of canned salmon, but in landlocked towns where fresh fish never made it to the grocery counter, this was the closest thing to seafood on a Wednesday night. Number 23. Chicken pot pie. A single-serve pie in a foil tin with a flaky crust on top and a thick filling of chicken, peas, carrots, and diced potatoes in a cream sauce underneath. Some truck stops made them from scratch. Most used frozen ones from a food service supplier and baked them off a dozen at a time. Either way, you cracked through the top crust with a fork, and the steam rolled out carrying the smell of chicken broth and butter. A pot pie took 20 minutes to eat because the filling stayed volcanic hot in the center long after the crust cooled down. Drivers learned to eat from the edges in. Everything was sealed inside that crust, and that made it the safest bet on the menu if you were worried about a cook cutting corners. Number 22. Mock apple pie from Ritz crackers. You broke up 36 Ritz crackers into a pie shell, poured a sugar syrup of water, sugar, lemon juice, and cream of tartar over the top, dusted it with cinnamon, and baked it for 30 minutes. What came out tasted enough like apple pie that grown men asked for seconds. Ritz hit shelves on November 21, 1934, at 19 cents a pound, and within 3 years they were the best-selling cracker in the world. Apples were expensive, crackers were cheap. The cream of tartar mimicked apple's tart bite, and the lemon did the rest. By the Second World War, Nabisco was printing the recipe on every blue cracker box. Your grandmother served it at church suppers. Nobody guessed, but you could only pull it off if you served it warm. Cold mock apple pie tasted like a soggy cracker, and that was the rule every Depression-era hostess passed down without writing it on the recipe card. Number 7. Rice and pan drippings. A cup of long-grain white rice cooked on the stove, topped with the saved drippings from whatever meat you fried the night before. Bacon grease, sausage fat, the rendered drippings from a pork chop. You spooned it hot over the rice and stirred until every grain was coated and glistening. In the rural South, rice and drippings showed up on the table at least once a week, and the women who made it kept a coffee can of saved grease on the back of the stove the way other families kept a sugar bowl on the counter. It sounds plain because it was plain. But the fat carried a depth of flavor that no store-bought seasoning could touch, and a bowl of it on a cold evening in January settled something deep and quiet in your chest. Number 6. Tomato soup and grilled cheese. A can of Campbell's tomato soup made with milk instead of water, and a sandwich built from white bread, butter, and 2 slices of American cheese pressed flat in a hot skillet until the bread turned golden and the cheese pulled into strings when you tore it apart. This combination became so deeply embedded in American childhood that it works more as a memory than a recipe. Sick days home from school, snow days with the television on, Saturdays when both parents worked and the oldest kid made lunch for everyone else. Together, the soup and sandwich made a meal that felt like being taken care of, even if you were the one doing the cooking. Some meals survive not because they are impressive, but because they are kind. This was the kindest dinner in America. Ground beef and tomato soup casserole was one of the original soup-a-sauce shortcuts that Campbell's Test Kitchen popularized through the 1950s. The moment a can of condensed tomato soup became not a soup at all, but a braising liquid, a sauce. Raw ground beef went into a casserole first, broken into loose chunks without browning, and over it went a can of condensed tomato soup, Worcestershire, sliced onion, and a pinch of garlic powder. Covered and baked at 350 for 45 minutes, the beef released its fat into the soup, and the tomato condensed and darkened, going from the thin orange of the can to something richer with a slow, savory backbone. Served over mashed potatoes or white bread, it tasted like someone had been tending a pot all afternoon when nobody had touched it since it went into the oven. The can of tomato soup started at 10 cents in the 1940s and changed how a generation understood what a sauce could be. Not a starting point, but the whole answer. Number 25, Welsh rarebit. A melted cheese sauce poured over thick toast. That was the whole meal. In the 1890s, it was a fashionable dish served in silver chafing dishes at society parties. By the 1950s, it had moved from the parlor to the kitchen. Betty Crocker put it in her picture cookbook in 1950. The American version used Velveeta or processed cheddar, a can of Campbell's tomato soup, a splash of milk, and a pinch of dry mustard. You melted it all together in one saucepan over low heat. 15 minutes. The entire dish cost about 50 cents and fed 4 people. Your mother probably called it cheese toast. Your grandmother probably called it supper. It sat at a strange crossroads in the 1950s, a dish with a foreign name that any woman in America could make from 2 ingredients she already had in the cupboard. Swiss steak was on the table before the word braising entered anyone's vocabulary. She took a cheap round steak, the cut nobody else wanted, laid it on the counter, and drove a meat mallet into it until the flour disappeared into the surface. Then it went into a heavy pan, browned on both sides, and buried under canned tomatoes and sliced onions. The lid went on. The oven went low. 2 hours later, that kitchen smelled like something that cost far more than it did. The name had nothing to do with Switzerland. Swissing was the tenderizing technique, the process of pounding a cheap cut into submission. Reynolds Wrap Aluminum spread the recipe in the late 1940s by suggesting home cooks line the pan with foil for easy cleanup, and suddenly it was in better homes and gardens, community cookbooks, church bulletins. Round steak was 50 cents a pound. The gravy it made, thick and rust red, rich with rendered fat, was worth 10 times that on a winter Tuesday. You can find the recipe anywhere. You cannot find the hands that made it taste like that. Number 13. Hopping John. Black-eyed peas simmered with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock, then spooned over white rice with chopped onion and a shake of hot sauce. The peas cooked down until they were soft but still held their shape, and the pork fat gave the pot liquor a smoky richness that soaked into the rice. This dish came to the American South through West African foodways carried by enslaved people, and it stayed because it worked. Black-eyed peas dried well and stored through the winter. The rice was filler. The salt pork was cheap. In the Carolinas and Georgia, families ate it on New Year's Day for good luck, but across the rest of the South, it was a weeknight supper that showed up whenever the pantry needed to stretch. Number 24. Morton Spaghetti and Meatballs Dinner. Morton was the budget brand, and this tray proved it. Thin spaghetti and a watery tomato sauce with 3 small meatballs that were more breadcrumb than beef. The side was usually a square of garlic bread that came out of the oven either rock hard or soggy, never anything in between. Morton sold these for less than Swanson, and families on tight budgets stacked them deep in the chest freezer. The sauce left an orange ring on the aluminum that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Kids loved it because it was spaghetti they could eat in front of the television without their mother hovering. Parents loved it because it cost less than a pound of ground beef. Before I go further, for the folks who want more old recipes like these all in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is a collection of forgotten recipes you will not find in any store. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 8. Canned salmon patties. You drained the can of pink salmon into a bowl, picked out the bigger bones and the skin, and mashed what was left with a fork. Mixed in a beaten egg, a handful of crushed saltine crackers, a squeeze of lemon, and a little salt and pepper. Shape the mixture into flat patties about the size of your palm and fried them in a skillet with a thin layer of oil until both sides turned golden brown and crispy. The outside crunched when you bit through it. The inside stayed soft and warm and tasted like something pulled straight from the coast and saved for a landlocked kitchen. Some people served them with tartar sauce, others ate them plain with a wedge of lemon and a pile of canned green beans on the side. A grandmother in North Carolina used to make these every Friday night because that was fish night in her house. She used the cheapest pink salmon the store carried, the kind in the tall can with the paper label. She crushed the crackers by hand inside a dish towel, and she measured nothing. A palm full of cracker crumbs. 1 egg, whatever was left of the lemon sitting in the door of the refrigerator. Her grandchildren fought over the last patty every single week. They did not know the whole recipe cost less than a loaf of bread. They just knew it was Friday, and Friday meant the kitchen smelled like crispy salmon and lemon and hot oil, and that was enough. She just stood at the stove and fried the patties until they were perfect, and when the plate hit the table, every hand reached at once. Number 19. Wiener and bean bake. You sliced a package of hot dogs into coins, stirred them into 2 cans of pork and beans, added a spoonful of yellow mustard and a squeeze of ketchup, and poured the whole thing into a baking dish. Some families laid extra hot dog halves across the top like little logs. Others mixed in diced onion or a handful of brown sugar. Then you baked it until the edges bubbled and the sauce turned thick and dark. This was not a recipe anyone wrote down. It was not in any cookbook. It was the meal that happened when a mother opened the refrigerator, found a package of Franks and not much else, and reached for the canned beans on the shelf because she knew the combination worked. Every family had a version. The variations were small and fiercely defended. Some used barbecue sauce instead of ketchup. Others stirred in a can of drained pineapple chunks, which sounds wrong but tasted like summer. A few families in the Midwest topped the dish with cornbread batter and baked it until the bread rose up golden over the beans. Children loved it because it tasted like a backyard cookout served indoors. Parents loved it because the whole dish cost less than the gas it took to drive to the store. 1 package of hot dogs and 2 cans of beans fed a table of 6, and the baking dish came out of the oven looking like something you had planned all along. Number 16. Country-style ribs. Not actual ribs. Thick-cut pieces from the blade end of a pork loin, bone-in, braised in a roasting pan with bottled barbecue sauce until the meat pulled apart and the sauce turned into a sticky, dark glaze. A cook could load a pan with 20 pounds of these before the lunch rush, slide it into the oven, and pull it out 4 hours later with enough to serve through dinner. They came with baked beans and coleslaw, and the barbecue sauce got everywhere. On your fingers, on the table, on the napkin wadded up next to your coffee cup. Country-style ribs were a mess, and drivers loved them for it. Number 8. Liver and onions with brown gravy. You sliced a pound of beef liver, dredged it in seasoned flour, and fried it in bacon grease 2 minutes aside. You pulled the liver out, cooked 2 sliced onions in the same pan until they were dark and sweet, then poured a cup of beef broth in to scrape up the brown bits and thicken the gravy with the leftover flour on the meat. Liver was the cheapest cut at the butcher counter for 65 years. It is full of iron and B12, which is why Depression-era doctors prescribed it for tired mothers and growing children. You ate it because it was free or close to it. You remember it because your grandmother soaked it in milk for an hour first, and that is the trick that made it tender. The second trick was the heat. You never cooked liver past medium. More than 2 minutes aside and it turned to leather. Pink in the middle, crisp outside, under dark, sweet onions. Number 24. Milk toast. This was the dinner you made when somebody was running a fever, or when the cupboard was almost bare, or when you simply did not have the energy to do anything else. 2 slices of bread, toasted just enough to hold their shape, laid flat in a shallow bowl. You heated milk on the stove with a pat of butter and a pinch of sugar, poured it warm over the toast, and ate it slowly with a spoon. In the 1940s and 1950s, milk toast was what mothers made for sick children and what widowed men ate alone at the kitchen table on quiet evenings. It cost almost nothing. It required almost nothing. And it was warm, and it was soft, and at the end of a long day, that was enough. If you grew up in Texas, this dish required no occasion. It appeared in a 9x13 pan at every church supper and gathering from the 1960s onward. King Ranch chicken has a murky origin that the actual King Ranch in South Texas has always declined to claim. But by the time it spread through community cookbooks and church pamphlets across the state, it had become one of the defining one-dish meals of Texas home cooking. Torn corn tortillas go in a loose layer. Not stacked tight, they need room to absorb. shredded chicken, and a mixture of cream of chicken soup, cream of mushroom soup, rotel diced tomatoes with green chilies, and sour cream go over that. Another tortilla layer, another filling layer, then cheddar and Monterey Jack across the top. 350, 45 minutes. The rotel is the key. The green chili heat cutting through the sour cream and double soup, making the whole dish taste more deliberate than a collection of cans has any right to. Number 11, skillet pork chops with cream of mushroom gravy. Pan-fried pork chops with pan gravy go back to the 19th century in American cooking. The 1950s version replaced the scratch gravy with a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup. Good Housekeeping recommended pork chops in a thrifty meals column in January 1952. Bone-in chops cost about 45 cents a pound. You browned 4 chops in a hot skillet, added sliced onion and mushrooms, poured in 1 can of soup mixed with half a can of water, covered the pan, and simmered for 25 minutes. The whole meal cost about 80 cents. The soup made its own gravy. You served it over egg noodles or mashed potatoes. For the working mother of the 1950s, the condensed soup eliminated the step that separated a 30-minute dinner from a 60-minute one. That step was the roux, and the roux was what most women quietly dreaded making on a Tuesday night. But if creamed corn marked the peak of summer, Saturday night baked beans marked something older and more deliberate, a tradition requiring 2 full days and tolerating no shortcuts. New England families had been slow-baking dried navy beans with salt pork, molasses, and dry mustard since the colonial era, the practice tied to the Puritan prohibition on Sunday cooking. The beans, soaked overnight Friday, went into the bean pot Saturday morning with a slab of salt pork, molasses, and dry mustard. Into a low oven, uncovered for the last hour so the top beans developed a skin and the pork rind crisped. The smell built through the house all day, deep, sweet, slightly smoky, so that by supper time it had become inseparable from the idea of Saturday itself. You made them in a ceramic bean pot if you had one, a Dutch oven if you didn't. Either way, the house smelled like a home by afternoon. Number 24, scrapple. A Pennsylvania Dutch invention made from pork scraps and trimmings cooked down with cornmeal and spices until the mixture was thick enough to slice. You poured it into a pan, let it firm up in the icebox, then cut it into slabs and fried them until the outside was crackling and dark. The inside stayed soft and rich, somewhere between sausage and polenta. Scrapple was the ultimate waste-nothing food. The parts of the hog that had no other use got a second life in that loaf pan. In eastern Pennsylvania and parts of Maryland, scrapple was breakfast food, but plenty of families ate it for dinner with a side of applesauce or fried eggs. Number 7. Banquet's Salisbury Steak Dinner. Banquet's Salisbury steak was a ground beef patty in mushroom gravy with mashed potatoes and a vegetable on the side. The patty was softer than Swanson's version, almost loose in the center, and the mushroom gravy had real mushroom pieces floating in it, which surprised people who expected Banquet to cut every corner they could find. That gravy was the reason this dinner had loyal fans. It was thick, savory, and poured over the mashed potatoes, turning the entire tray into one continuous flavor. Banquet kept this dinner through the 1960s and into the next decade, adjusting the recipe as ingredient costs shifted. The version from 1968 was not the same as the one from 1974, but both came in the same box and nobody was told. The original 1960s Banquet Salisbury steak, the one with that thick mushroom gravy and real mushroom pieces, disappeared from freezers long ago. The name survived, but the dinner inside the box became something else entirely. Number 16. Canned beef ravioli. You opened the can, poured the ravioli into a saucepan, and heated it over medium until the sauce started to bubble around the edges. That was the whole recipe. The ravioli came already stuffed, already sauced, already seasoned. All you had to do was get it warm. Chef Boyardee was the name on most of those cans, and millions of people grew up eating it straight from the pot with a spoon because transferring it to a bowl felt like a wasted step. The beef inside the pasta pockets was soft and finely ground, more paste than meat, but it carried enough flavor to make every bite feel intentional. Seniors ate this on nights when standing at the stove for more than 5 minutes felt like too much to ask. 1 can, 1 burner, 1 pot, and dinner was done before the evening news came on. Number 12. Codfish cakes. Salt cod soaked overnight in cold water, then flaked and mixed with mashed potato, a beaten egg, and black pepper. You shaped the mixture into thick patties and fried them in a skillet until both sides turned deep golden brown. In Catholic families across New England and the Mid-Atlantic, this was Friday dinner every single week. The church said no meat on Fridays, and salt cod was cheap and kept for months without refrigeration. The outside of each cake went crispy while the inside stayed soft and flaky. You served them with tartar sauce or a squeeze of lemon and a side of coleslaw. By the late 1970s, most families had stopped buying salt cod entirely, and codfish cakes went from a weekly ritual to something only grandmothers still knew how to make. Number 24. Fried chicken dinner. A 2-piece or 3-piece plate with a thigh, a leg, and sometimes a wing, all battered and fried until the skin turned golden brown and crackled when you bit through it. The chicken sat in a warming tray, and the pieces closest to the heat lamp got extra crispy on one side. Mashed potatoes with gravy and a scoop of coleslaw came standard. The breading was thick because thick batter stayed crispy longer under the lamp, and the seasoning was salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and a paprika. The fried chicken dinner was usually the most expensive plate on the menu, around $2.25 in 1973. Drivers ordered it on payday. Number 20. Tuna noodle casserole. You opened a can of chicken of the sea, a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, boiled egg noodles, mixed it with a cup of milk, topped it with crushed potato chips, and broiled it 10 minutes. The first printed recipe came out of Sunset magazine in 1930 from a Kennewick, Washington woman named only as Mrs. W.F.S. Campbell's introduced cream of mushroom soup in 1934, and that one product is the reason your grandmother made this every Thursday for 31 years. By 1959, 8 out of 10 households served canned tuna weekly, with this casserole in the top 3 uses. It fed a working family of 5 for less than $1. It still does. Your aunt is still making it. The genius detail was the potato chip crust on top, which turned to glass under the broiler and shattered when you ran the spoon through the dish. The crunch is what your cousins remembered, not the tuna, the chips. Number 16. Fried potatoes and onions, a cast iron skillet, a spoonful of lard or bacon grease, and whatever potatoes you had on hand. You sliced them thin, layered them in the hot pan with sliced onions, and let them cook low and slow until the bottom layer went golden and crunchy. Flip the whole pile, season with salt and pepper, and wait again. That was the entire method. In Appalachia and across the rural South, fried potatoes and onions was the answer to the question of what to cook when the pantry was almost bare and payday was still 2 days away. A 10-pound bag of potatoes in 1958 stretched across 2 full weeks of dinners if you were careful with your knife. It was not exciting. It did not need to be. It was warm, and it was there. There is a particular kind of quiet in the kitchen of someone who cooks only for themselves. No children to call to the table, no spouse coming through the back door at 5:30. Just 1 plate, 1 glass, 1 fork laid down on the counter. Millions of American seniors eat alone every night, and many of the meals on this list were built for exactly that reality. Not portioned down from a family recipe, but designed from the ground up for 1 person, 1 appetite, and 1 burner on the stove. The sadness is not that they eat alone. The sadness is that so many stopped cooking altogether because someone told them it was not worth the effort for just 1 person. It is worth it. It always was. A pot of soup simmered for 1 is still a pot of soup made with care. Number 16. Corned beef hash skillet. Hormel introduced Mary Kitchen canned corned beef hash around 1950. It became the #1 selling hash in America and has held that position ever since. The skillet technique was simple. You pressed the hash flat in a cast iron pan, let it form a dark brown crust on the bottom, flipped it in sections, and cracked 2 eggs over the top. 15 minutes. Under 55 cents. Corned beef hash was what veterans made. It required nothing perishable. It tasted like the Army, like the Navy, like basic training. In the early 1950s, with 16 million World War II veterans still in their 20s and 30s, this dish carried an emotional weight that went beyond the ingredients. It appeared on diner menus from Maine to California as a blue plate special for under $50. Creamed chipped beef on toast had a name that polite company didn't repeat, and the soldiers who ate it in mess halls from the First World War through Korea knew exactly what that name was. The Army had been serving dried, salt-cured beef, shaved thin and folded into white gravy, butter, flour, and milk, since the early 1900s, when it needed a high-protein, shelf-stable staple it could produce in bulk. When the men came home, a generation of wives learned to make it because their husbands asked. The dried beef came in small glass jars at the grocery, packed by Armour or Hormel, paper-thin slices folded like damp pages. You soaked them briefly to pull some of the salt, added them to the roux at the last minute, let the sauce coat every piece. Spooned over thick white toast, it filled you in the way only cheap food can, the kind that sits in you for hours. By the 1970s, it had largely left the family table, but one smell of that buttery salt on toast and 40 years disappear. Ground beef hash was the sound of a skillet crackling at sunset. Potatoes, onions, and beef came together without a recipe, guided only by instinct and experience. Everything sizzled together until the potatoes browned and the onions turned sweet. A sprinkle of salt and pepper was all it needed, though some mothers tossed in a dash of ketchup or Worcestershire for depth. It was hearty, filling, and honest, the kind of dinner that didn't talk, just did its job. Every bite had texture, soft in the middle, crisp at the edges, and rich with flavor from the browned bits stuck to the pan. It was food meant to be eaten hot, straight from the skillet, with maybe a fried egg on top if you were lucky. Nothing about it was wasted. Nothing about it was delicate. It was survival turned delicious, the sound of care disguised as simplicity. Fried cabbage and sausage was a one-pan wonder that stretched a single link of smoked sausage into a meal that fed body and soul alike. Cabbage cost almost nothing and kept for weeks in the refrigerator, making it a staple for seniors watching their budgets. The sausage was sliced into coins and browned until the fat rendered out. Then shredded cabbage was added and cooked until wilted and slightly caramelized. The cabbage absorbed the smoky, porky flavor from the drippings, transforming from a humble vegetable into something deeply satisfying. A splash of vinegar or a sprinkle of caraway seeds added complexity without adding cost. The dish came together in under 20 minutes and required nothing more than a cutting board and a skillet. One small head of cabbage and one sausage link created enough food for 3 meals, making it extraordinarily economical. The sweetness of the cooked cabbage balanced the salty richness of the sausage perfectly, proving that poverty cooking could produce genuinely delicious results. Number 18. Hash. Whatever meat was left from a previous dinner, chopped fine and fried in a skillet with diced potatoes, onion, and salt. Corned beef hash was the most famous version, but hash in the 1950s was rarely that specific. It was whatever you had. Leftover roast beef, a few slices of ham, the end of a pot roast. You cut it all up, mixed it with potatoes, pressed it flat in a hot skillet, and let the bottom get crusty before flipping. A fried egg on top was the finishing touch. Hash was not a recipe. It was a system for turning scraps into something worth sitting down for. Number 21. Banquet enchilada dinner. Banquet saw what Patio was doing and wanted a piece of the Mexican frozen dinner market. Their version was simpler. 2 beef enchiladas in red sauce with rice and beans on the side. The sauce was thicker than Patio's, the beef was grainier, and the tortillas fell apart if you looked at them wrong. Banquet priced it lower and pushed it into grocery stores across the Midwest and South. It sold well enough to stay on shelves for years, but it never earned the following that Patio built with their tamale and enchilada combination. Banquet pulled it quietly when their Mexican line stopped competing against the newer brands that came along in the 1970s. Nobody held a funeral for it. There was a ritual to those trays that nobody talks about anymore. You pulled one from the freezer, read the temperature on the box, slid it onto the oven rack, and waited. The house filled with that specific frozen dinner smell, somewhere between steam and tin and whatever seasoning powder the factory used that week. When the timer went off, you pulled it out with a dish towel because the aluminum edges could draw blood if you grabbed them careless. You peeled back the foil and the steam hit your face. It was never good the way a home-cooked meal was good. But it was done. It was hot. And it asked nothing of you except 25 minutes and an oven set to 425 degrees. For millions of people coming home tired, that was enough. That was the whole point. Number 25, Spam and Egg Skillet. You sliced the Spam thin, maybe a 1/4 inch, and laid each piece flat in a hot skillet with a little butter. You let it crisp until the edges went golden and almost crunchy. Then you cracked 2 eggs right beside it and fried them in the rendered fat. Salt, pepper, a slice of toast if you had bread. That was the whole production. 1 can of Spam stretched across 3 meals if you were careful. Breakfast, lunch, and then a fried Spam sandwich at the end of the day. But when money was truly gone and the refrigerator had nothing else in it, this became dinner. Hot, filling, and nobody at the table pretended it was anything other than what it was. You ate it, and you were grateful. Number 7. Beans and Franks. A pot of navy beans soaked overnight, simmered all day with molasses, mustard, and a chunk of salt pork, then served with sliced frankfurters stirred in at the end. Boston claimed the dish. So did every small town in New England and every lumber camp in the upper Midwest. The beans went in the oven Saturday morning and came out Saturday night, dark and thick and sweet enough to eat with brown bread on the side. Families who could not afford a roast served this as their Saturday supper for years running, and nobody called it a sacrifice. The Franks were optional but common. They plumped up in the hot beans and split open at the seams, and children pulled them out with their fingers and ate them first. 1 pot lasted the weekend. Cold beans on Sunday morning with toast was not leftovers. It was tradition. Number 18, Veal Cutlet. A thin piece of veal pounded flat, breaded with cracker crumbs, and pan-fried in butter until both sides turned crisp and golden. It came with a lemon wedge and a side of spaghetti or mashed potatoes depending on where you stopped. Veal was still affordable in the 1970s. A truck stop outside of Chicago or Milwaukee could get it from local suppliers for less than beef, and the breading stretched a small piece of meat into a plate that looked like a real dinner. The breading did all the work. It made the cutlet look bigger, soaked up the butter, and gave the plate a richness plain grilled meat could not match. By the late 1980s, veal prices climbed and it vanished from truck stop menus almost overnight. Number 6, fried bologna sandwich for supper. You laid a slice of Oscar Mayer bologna in a hot, dry skillet, cut 4 shallow slits around the edge so it would not curl, and fried it 90 seconds aside until the surface was a dark, blistered brown. You slid it onto soft white bread with yellow mustard. That was supper for a coal miner in Harlan County in 1955 and a single mother in Akron in 1981. Bologna was the cheapest meat in the deli case from the war through the 1979 recession. 29 cents a pound in 1968, 69 cents a pound in 1980. Your grandfather called it Kentucky steak. He was not joking, and he was not ashamed. He worked 38 years underground. The slits in the edge were the engineering most people miss. Without them, the bologna ballooned in the middle, and the edges burnt black before the center got hot. With them, the slice stayed flat, and the surface caramelized like a thin steak. Number 23. Salmon patties. A can of pink salmon, drained and picked clean of bones and skin, mixed with crushed saltine crackers, 1 beaten egg, and a little diced onion. You shaped them into flat rounds and fried them in Crisco or vegetable oil until they turned golden on both sides. Families across the South and the Midwest made these every Friday, partly because they were affordable and partly because a lot of Catholic households still avoided meat at the end of the week. Serve them alongside canned green beans and instant mashed potatoes, and you had a plate that looked like it took an hour. It took about 12 minutes from start to table. and I have never met a single person who grew up in the 1960s and does not remember the smell of salmon patties frying on a Friday afternoon. You started it the night before. That was the only rule anyone gave you, and if you forgot, the beans never softened right and everyone at the table knew. Dried navy beans soaked overnight, then buried in a low casserole under a smoked ham hock, sliced onion, 2 bay leaves, and enough broth to cover by an inch. Foil over the top, 300 degrees, 3 hours. The beans broke down at the edges while holding shape in the center. The collagen from the ham hock turned the broth silky, and the smoke spread through every bean in the dish. You pulled the hock out at the end and stripped every strand of meat back into the pot because nothing left the kitchen that could still feed someone. During the Depression years, navy beans cost pennies per pound, and ham hocks were sold for almost nothing because nobody else wanted them. What nobody wanted became the thing that carried families through cold months, and the only skill it required was remembering to start it the night before. Those 100 dinners sat in cookbooks that nobody opened for decades, waiting for someone to flip to the right page. Most of the people who cooked them never wrote the recipe down anywhere else. If you grew up eating any of these, tell us which one in the comments. Share this video with someone who would remember. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time so you never miss another list like this one.